Good afternoon and welcome back to the Public Service Commission as we continue in the hearing in docket number 2023-9-E. This is the docket concerning Dominion Energy South Carolina's 2023 Integrated Resource Plan. Let's take a roll call of commissioners. With us virtually, we have Vice Chair Powers and Commissioner Irvin. Present in the hearing room, we have Commissioner Justin Williams, Commissioner Thomas, Commissioner Carolee Williams, Commissioner Caston, and Chair Belser. Where we left off, ORS had finished their witness presentation, and we are now on the interveners. I think the witnesses are jointly sponsored by Sierra Club, Coastal Conservation League, and Southern Environmental. Why am I doing this? Southern Alliance for Clean Energy. Thank you. I apologize. I drew a blank there. Ms. Mixon, you're recognized.
Thank you. Madam Chair, CCL, SACE, and Sierra Club called joint witness Jim Gravatt to the stand.
Sir, raise your right hand, please. Do you swear affirm the testimony you're about to give to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Can you please state your name, title, and employer for the record?
Yes, my name is Jim Gravatt. I work for Energy Futures Group.
Did you cause to be pre-filed in this docket on June 27th, 2023, direct testimony consisting of 51 pages?
Yes.
Do you have any changes or corrections to your pre-filed direct testimony at this time?
No.
And Mr. Gravatt, if the answers put to you in your direct testimony were asked of you at the hearing today, would your answers be the same?
Yes.
And did you also attach to your direct testimony two exhibits identified as exhibits JG1 and JG2?
I did.
And were the exhibit...
Chair,
Commissioner Irvin?
I apologize, Ms. Mixon. I apologize. This is John Burns.
Oh, Ms. John.
I apologize, Ms. Mixon. We don't have, at least I don't have video from the hearing room. I just have indication that people are speaking and I can hear them. I don't know if any other remote participants have that same problem.
Just a moment, please.
I wanted to bring it up before the witness really got going.
Yeah, just a second. We're checking into that, Mr. Burns. Thank you for bringing it to our attention. Do you have it now?
It's just showing me the seal of the state of your Public Service Commission. That's
okay.
all I see.
We're working on it.
I don't know if the other commissioners have that or not.
Commissioner Irvin, what are you seeing, sir?
I see everyone, including the hearing room and Mr. Burns. And
all right, I'm going to log out and log back in. It may be a problem on my end, Madam Chair.
Yeah, you might want to check your video feed too, make sure it's not off.
Can we just stand at ease for a second while he logs in or logs out and logs back in? Can y'all let me know in the back when he gets back in?
That fixed it.
That
I
fixed it?
apologize. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Burns. Ms. Mixon, please proceed.
Okay, thank you. So, Mr. Gravatt, were the exhibits to your direct testimony prepared by you or under your direction?
Yes.
Madam Chair, I'd move to have Mr. Gravatt's pre-filed direct testimony entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Mr. Gravatt's pre-filed direct testimony will be received into the record if given orally.
And I would also move to have exhibits JG1 and JG2 as attached to Mr. Gravatt's pre-filed direct testimony entered into the record as the next composite hearing exhibit.
Mr. Gravatt's exhibits JG1 and JG2, which were pre-filed with his direct testimony, will be a composite exhibit marked for identification as hearing exhibit 15 and received into the evidence of this case.
Thank you. Mr. Gravatt, did you also cause to be pre-filed in this docket on August 15th, 2023, surrebuttal testimony consisting of 13 pages?
Yes.
Do you have any changes or corrections to your pre-filed surrebuttal testimony at this time?
No.
And if the questions put to you in your surrebuttal testimony were asked at the hearing today, would your answers be the same?
They would.
Madam Chair, I'd move to have Mr. Gravatt's pre-filed surrebuttal testimony entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Mr. Gravatt's pre-filed surrebuttal testimony will be entered into the record as if given from the stand.
Thank you. So, Mr. Gravatt, I'm going to ask you some questions to walk through a summary of your testimony, but I first want to start with your expert qualifications. Can you provide the Commission a summary of what your current job entails?
I would be happy to. I've worked since 2013 at Energy Futures Group, which is a small Vermont-based clean energy consulting firm. We also have offices in Boston and in New York. And Energy Futures Group is referred to often as EFG. If you hear that acronym or if I use that, that's what I'm referring to. We work with regulators, utilities, government agencies, and advocacy groups to design, implement, and evaluate programs and policies to promote investments in efficiency, renewables, other distributed resources, and strategic electrification. In my role, I advise regulators, utilities, program administrators, environmental organizations, and low-income and affordable housing advocates on industry-leading best practice approaches to designing and managing energy efficiency programs, including multifamily, low-income, residential retrofit, new construction, HVAC, and efficient products programs.
Thank you. And what did you do prior to joining EFG in 2013?
Well, I've worked in energy efficiency since 1991. In 1991, I got my first job in the industry as an energy auditor for Vermont's low-income weatherization program, where I conducted personally hundreds of comprehensive energy audits for Vermont's income-eligible families, and we used diagnostic tools including blower doors, infrared thermography, combustion efficiency and safety testing. Later, I served as the associate director of the local weatherization program in northwestern Vermont. Following that, I spent about a dozen years at the local gas utility, Vermont Gas, working in their energy efficiency programs, first conducting the same kind of comprehensive audits for a range of customers of the gas company, and then increasingly in management roles. By the time I left after a dozen years, I was managing both the commercial and residential energy efficiency portfolios, and in that role also interacting with regulators quite a bit. And I'd like to mention that at the time I was leading those programs, the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy completed its first survey of exemplary natural gas efficiency programs, and 6 of the programs under my leadership were included in that analysis of exemplary programs. In 2005, I joined Vermont Energy Investment Corporation as Director of Residential Energy Services, with responsibility for strategic planning and overall implementation for the residential portfolio. During that time, the residential portfolio approximately doubled in scope in the years that I was there. And included in that portfolio was an integrated program for low-income households where we worked closely with the low-income weatherization providers. They would provide a seamless one-stop service to the households, and Efficiency Vermont would provide funding to increase the scope and scale of the projects that they completed. Also, while I was at VEIC, I led startup of the residential programs when VEIC was awarded the contract to implement the District of Columbia Sustainable Energy Utility. And I did some consulting as well.
Thank you. And so just to be clear, in those prior roles, did you design and implement energy efficiency programs for utilities?
Absolutely. I was responsible, as I said, for strategic planning, program design, and successful implementation. So designing those programs wasn't just a matter of designing a program and sending people off to do it and seeing what happened, but it was constantly gathering data about the performance of the programs and working with the crew to develop enhancements that would improve their performance.
Thank you. And so, again, in your roles, have you successfully helped utilities design or make changes to their programs to improve savings or to meet specified savings targets?
Absolutely. As I just suggested, it's it's never really enough to just start something and then see what happens or assume that it's good enough and it either works or it doesn't, and whatever happens is whatever happens. We always worked on a continuous improvement basis, working both to improve the effectiveness of the programs, to improve and expand the savings that were provided to customers, and to make it easier for them to participate in the programs, and to ensure that we had robust data collection so that we were reporting and tracking and reporting what we were able to accomplish. And, a lot of this work revolves around identifying the barriers to participation and coming up with strategies to help customers overcome those barriers so that they have the information and the resources to do energy efficiency that will benefit them.
And so when you say that you've helped design programs or make changes to programs to improve participation and savings, would you describe that as program like optimization?
Absolutely. I can give you an example. When I was at Vermont Gas, we had a comprehensive retrofit program. And when I started there, the program, an auditor from the company would go out to customers' home and do the analysis and make recommendations, and then hand that off to the customer, and they would have to go out and find contractors to do the work and get estimates and submit those estimates to the company for review, and they would again be screened for cost effectiveness, and then we'd figure out which measures we could support, and there were a lot of steps for the customer to go through. And a lot of them they got the audit and then they just stopped because it was too much work. So we modified the program where we did a procurement for contractors. We got fixed pricing from about half a dozen contractors. We would go out and do the audit. We would calculate the job price. We would tell the customer, we can send someone to your house to do this work and this is what it's going to cost you, and it will not cost more than this. And all they had to do was say yes. And that dramatically increased participation and it made customers a lot happier.
Thank you, Mr. Gravatt. Madam Chair, at this time, based on Mr. Gravatt's extensive experience and qualifications, we would request that he be qualified as an expert witness in energy efficiency program design, implementation, and optimization.
Any questions regarding the witness's qualifications? Hearing none, Mr. Gravatt will be accepted as an expert in energy program design, implementation, and optimization.
And just to be clear, Charles, it's an energy efficiency program design.
Excuse me, thank you. Energy efficiency program design, implementation, and optimization. I can't read my own writing.
Me neither. I definitely understand. All right, so Mr. Gravatt, turning back to your testimony, what was the purpose of your direct testimony in this proceeding?
Surely. The purpose of my testimony was to review the DSM savings included in DESC's IRP, both to determine whether those savings levels, as supported by the 2023 Market Potential Study, were reasonable, and to evaluate whether DESC complied with the Commission's order in the 2020 IRP when presenting its energy efficiency potential study in this IRP.
And why is energy efficiency important for utilities and utility customers?
Well, as I describe in my direct testimony, energy efficiency programs provide many direct and indirect benefits for customers, both those customers who participate in the programs and customers as a whole. The fundamental premise of energy efficiency programs is that if energy efficiency can reduce companies' energy and capacity requirements at a lower cost than building new generation or new distribution or new transmission, then that's in the customer's interest. Because in every jurisdiction where I work, utilities are expected to provide safe, reliable energy at the least cost. And energy efficiency is widely recognized as a least cost tool to meeting the requirements of providing safe and reliable energy. So, simply put, a megawatt the utility doesn't have to produce is cheaper than having the generation and the transmission and the distribution to deliver that megawatt. And I won't say it's always cheaper, but it's any opportunity to reduce the load cost effectively. If it's cost effective, that means it costs less than the alternatives, and that's in the customer's interest and consistent with utilities' obligation for least cost service delivery. But beyond that, and frankly, this is one of the reasons why I love working in this field, because supporting utilities in providing least cost service delivery comes with this incredible benefit of improving the lives of the customers who participate, both in their homes and in their businesses. Reduces bills, it improves comfort, it often improves health and safety outcomes for the people who live in those homes, and it provides a level of security, especially for energy insecure households, that it's very hard to achieve in other ways. And it does so as part of the core premise of reducing overall utility costs. So that's a lot of bang for the buck there. And if I can add, we've discussed it a bit that South Carolina is, there's a lot of poverty here. I previously appeared in front of this commission in a DEC rate case last year, where I did some analysis of energy burden for the company's customers and looked at the impact that the rate increase would have on worsening energy burden for those customers. I have not done that analysis for DESC, but there's no reason to think that there are not a lot of highly energy burdened customers. Homes are often leaky, poorly insulated, may have older appliances and older HVAC, and so there's a lot of need for those secondary benefits that are so important to the households that participate.
And so what are the other benefits of energy efficiency programs that may not be recognized in cost effectiveness testing?
Well, I think there are many, and I appreciate your question. You say they may not be recognized. In some jurisdictions, they are recognized. I was just in a proceeding in Maryland where there was an extensive stakeholder process, work group process to provide economic value to many, many benefits that aren't always included. And these included greenhouse gas emissions, included improved health and safety for participating residential households. It included reduced arrearage costs for utilities, because if fewer customers are falling behind in their payments, the utility doesn't have to spend as much to go out and get them to pay. There's economic benefits, and again, there's an Inflation Reduction Act. Why is it called Inflation Reduction Act? Well, one of the ideas is it's going to stimulate the economy and create jobs. Energy efficiency creates jobs. That's often not quantified, but it's hard to argue with. And there's a reliability benefit too, not just, well, there's a couple of reliability benefits really. We can say, when there's less demand, there's improved reliability for the grid. There's less risk of bumping up against constraints. There's also reliability for, especially when we're talking about homes that have been insulated and air sealed. There have been some studies that have identified that a home that's well insulated will maintain temperature longer in the case of a power outage than a home that is not well insulated. And I think this has mostly been looked at in colder climates, but it's going to be the same in hot heating climates. If the power goes out, your house is going to stay more comfortable for longer, which could have some really significant health benefits for the occupants.
Thank you. Mr. Gravatt, I'm going to actually skip this next question because I think you've already covered it. So what did Commission Order 2020-832 say about how Dominion should evaluate energy efficiency in DSM in this IRP?
Well, specifically, that in the 2023 IRP, Dominion must include a comprehensive evaluation of the cost effectiveness and achievability of DSM portfolios reaching 1% and higher savings, 1%, 1.25%, 1.5%, 1.75%, and 2%, and to work with the EE Advisory Group to develop and characterize these levels of DSM savings. The Commission also required Dominion to, as part of its presentation in the 23 IRP, to include potential incentive options and best practices to achieve the modeled levels of DSM. And the Commission order was clear that DESC needed to evaluate substantive additions and modifications to its existing programs in doing so. In doing that, in my view, the Commission recognized part of its reasoning was that since there are a lot of other utilities in the country who are achieving these higher levels of savings, it would be good to understand what the barriers or the obstacles are to DESC achieving those higher levels. And if they could achieve higher levels cost effectively, to recognize that that would be in the best interest of ratepayers to require them to meet those higher savings levels. And, you know, as I understand it, the Commission really wanted an analysis that would give it enough information to understand what the opportunity was and what the barriers were, because nothing in this field is absolute. If there are barriers to achieving higher levels of efficiency, understanding what they are can help identify solutions.
And in your understanding, is the company bound to comply with Commission orders?
Yes.
Okay. How did the company characterize DSM in its IRP?
The company retained ICF, a consultant, to conduct a bottom-up process to determine the 15-year maximum achievable energy efficiency forecasts for 2023 to 2037. And as Mr. Durkee earlier described, they first assessed the technical potential, which is the, well, as he explained, it's the amount that could be saved regardless of the cost based on available technology and efficiency improvements. And also screened measures for cost effectiveness and estimated economic maximum achievable and achievable potential based on ICF's program data and expert judgment. And I just, for a second, I want to make sure it's clear that when we talk about maximum achievable and achievable potential, there's no absolute measure of that. Those are terms that are used frequently in the industry, and they have sort of widely understood meanings, but they are always dependent on the assumptions that are used in the model. And a maximum achievable potential doesn't actually mean that there's a law or a boundary or a technical constraint that would keep anyone from ever achieving more. It's just based on the assumptions that are included in the model. That's the most that the modeler thinks can reasonably be achieved. And I will also note, again, as Mr. Durkee discussed this morning, their estimate, ICF's estimate of maximum achievable and achievable, were largely based on ICF program data and expert judgment and historical program savings evaluation and cost data, and that's actually described in the potential study.
Thank you, Mr. Gravatt. I'm going to skip the next question too. So could you describe the steps you took to assess the market potential study and Dominion's DSM forecast?
Yes, I want to say first, I fully participated along with other advocates in the Energy Efficiency Advisory Group and provided quite a bit of input to the company during the development, at least during the early stages of the development of the potential study. Once we got to the point where it was filed and the IRP was filed, I reviewed the conclusions that ICF and the company had come up with about what was achievable and their approach to the commission required scenarios. That's what we tended to call them, the commission required scenarios, the 1, 1.25, 1.5, and so forth. And I compared them to best practice utilities. And importantly, I did not pick the highest achieving utilities. I picked a representative group of about a dozen utilities that were relatively high achieving from the Midwest, the South, the Mid-Atlantic, not from the New England states, not from California. And really, I think applied a common sense approach, a sort of a reality check. You know, what I learned in elementary school, when you're doing long math, you check your results because you want to make sure that they make sense. So that's the kind of review that I did of the scenarios that they put forward.
And what were your concerns with how ICF evaluated those commission required scenarios?
Well, looking specifically at the commission required scenarios, I have a couple of concerns, but largely, as ICF described, they did their bottom-up analysis, and according to their analysis, it would not be achievable to reach even 1%. So their conclusion was that none of the other scenarios higher than that would be achievable. And again, I want to emphasize that this is based on their analysis. It's not based on some absolute truth. So, yeah, again, as Mr. Durkee described, which is just very confusing to me, ICF assigned costs to those higher achieving scenarios that it did not believe could actually be achieved. Perhaps we can talk more about that, but that was very confusing to me. To me, and what the stakeholders requested and feel that we did not really have an opportunity to do was to iterate on what could be changed. How could these be approached differently? If these other utilities are achieving, 1.5%, 1.75% savings, what are they doing? How could that apply to DESC? And it's an iterative process. As I was talking about earlier with implementing programs, it's iterative. You make a design, you see what happens, you gather more data, and you make adjustments. But that process did not happen with the stakeholders, with the advisory group on these commission-required scenarios. ICF just said, can't get more than 0.74, so there's really no point in doing a whole lot more work on these commission-required scenarios. At least that is my view of what happened. They,
Mr. Gravatt, so just want to make sure we're getting through the summary. Could you please describe what you believe a reasonable process for ICF to evaluate those higher savings levels would have looked like?
Certainly, and I went ahead into that already. But it's really a questioning process. It's inquisition. It's looking at all the data that are out there. It's asking, how are they doing it? What's different about DESC that it doesn't seem that we could get to those higher numbers? And are those barriers, those obstacles, are there solutions to those that we could overcome so that we could achieve more cost-effective savings? As I said, it's an iterative process, and that's certainly how I would approach it, as a problem-solving question. I think it seemed like that's what the commission was looking for. How would you solve this problem?
And so did you raise your concerns about the market potential study at the Energy Efficiency Advisory Group?
Well, I did, and to be fair, I feel like, and I did say this in my testimony, certainly in the early stages, I felt like DESC and ICF were receptive to our input. But then at some point, we would get the outcomes of that, and it didn't make sense, and we'd start asking questions, and we might find out that there had been changes made after we'd provided input that they hadn't told us about. And I don't mean to say that there was anything, I don't believe that there was anything disingenuous about that. I understand this is a complicated process to do a potential study. There's a lot of work involved, and I think it was an oversight. Nevertheless, at the time we got this information, there wasn't anything to be done about it. So on the commission-required scenarios, we specifically asked repeatedly, when are we going to have the opportunity to iterate on these scenarios? We want to have the opportunity to iterate on these scenarios. We think it's important. We care about these scenarios. And, generally the answer is we're getting there, we need to finish this other part first. And then we were presented with the results that were in the potential study. and with no opportunity to provide any further input. So we really did not feel that we got that opportunity to iterate.
Okay. And another one of your concerns was ICF's failure to assess the impact of the IRA on customer participation rates and savings levels. Could you explain further?
Yes, I agree with ICF that there's a lot that is not known about the IRA. But I think what is pretty clear is that the effect of the IRA is not going to be nothing. And they've said, we don't know what the outcome is going to be, so I'm sorry, I don't remember Mr. Durkee's exact word, but I think he said it would be inappropriate or inaccurate or incorrect or something along those lines to reflect any impact of the IRA in the potential study. And my view on that is a potential study, as I've said, it doesn't give you the true answer. It gives you the result of an analysis based on many assumptions. There are ways to include assumptions with sensitivities. There are ways to be conservative or less conservative in assumptions. But when we know something is not going to be zero, it doesn't make sense to consider it as zero when you're doing a potential study.
Thank you. So let's see, if we could try to kind of move through some of these next ones fairly quickly. Based on your evaluation and critiques of the market potential study, you developed recommended modifications to Dominion's DSM forecast. How did you develop those?
Yes, and what I developed and what I recommend that the Commission consider is a scenario not based on requiring Dominion to achieve a certain level of savings in specific programs, but I looked at these dozen utilities that achieve between 1% and 2% annual savings as a percent of sales, and that's between 1% and 2% net savings as a percent of sales. And I looked at what programs they used to get to those savings levels, what the average cost of those savings was for each of the program types. And I'm talking about very conventional programs, residential home retrofit, HVAC promotion, residential new construction, small business, so forth. Nothing crazy here. And then I applied that because the way we did the analysis is we looked at, for each of these program types, what savings as a percent of sector sales these other utilities achieved on average. So we looked at business separately, then residential. In looking at business savings, for example, one of the things that is a concern in DESC territory is commercial opt-outs. So I did not apply my percent savings from the commercial sector to the whole commercial load, commercial industrial load, but to the load net of opt-outs to more accurately reflect what DESC has done. And really just look at average. I didn't, if I was going to do something that was really pushing, I would have used the highest achievers out of that group and made a recommendation that DESC should strive to be along with the highest achievers. It's not what I did. I looked at average and used that, just kind of simple math, to come up with an estimate of what I thought would be reasonable and achievable for them to accomplish.
Okay. And so just to be clear, were your recommended modifications, were they based on which programs were shown to be cost effective by ICF in their analysis? Yes.
So the step that I just described was really how I got into the ballpark of what I thought was going to be reasonable and achievable. What are other utilities doing with best practices? But the fact that ICF put forward levels of savings in various programs that were cost effective and yet much higher than what it included in its recommended medium case, to me, Mr. Durkee has since said that I shouldn't assume that because they put a cost and did the screening and that those programs were cost effective.
Mr. Gervais, I'll hold. Cause
Sorry.
I think that's in your rebuttal testimony.
Apologies.
Yeah, I think let's
Apologize.
maybe stick to let's stick to the script for a little bit here, just to make sure we get through this. So, did you make an adjustment to the costs for the HEC Tier 1 and 2 programs?
I did make well, the cost, I looked at the cost for those two programs and said if the Tier 1 and Tier 2 were combined, what would the weighted average cost per megawatt hour saved be? And that is at the 1% savings level. I believe that is the cost that I used. But I used that as a reality check on what could be achievable and compared that with the cost again of these other dozen programs that I looked at.
So other than that change, were each of the programs that you included in your higher savings estimate shown to be cost effective in the market potential study conducted by ICF?
Yes, they were.
Okay. And when you combine those programs into the portfolio with the savings you recommended, what savings level resulted?
My recommendation led to a savings level of about just under 1% of gross, 1% gross savings as a percent of sales when you include total sales, and about 1.25% when net of opt-outs in 2027. So there's when the programs will be fully ramped up.
Okay, and so other than those Tier 1 and 2 programs, did you also use the same proposed costs that ICF included in the market potential study?
I did. I calculated the cost per megawatt hour saved for each of the programs at the level of savings that I included.
All right, thank you. And in terms of timing, did you assume that Dominion could reach those higher savings levels right away?
No, I think it would be very reasonable to expect that it would take a little time to ramp up participation to reach the higher savings level. So I assumed a 3-year ramp up to reach the higher savings levels I recommend.
Okay. And then you sent those savings levels again in each year along with the associated costs, and those were included by Derek Stenslick in his modeling.
Exactly.
So turning to your sir rebuttal testimony, which Dominion witnesses did you respond to in that testimony?
I responded to the rebuttal testimony of Mr. Neely and Mr. Durkee.
Okay. So what portion of Mr. Neely's rebuttal did you respond to?
I responded to Mr. Neely's assertion that the modeling included by Mr. Stenklick was 20 times higher than what I had proposed, which seemed to be a misunderstanding of how the savings were applied from what I put in my testimony and what was used in the model.
Okay. And he's now corrected his testimony to remove.
That is my understanding.
Right? Okay. So turning to Dominion witness Drew Durkee's rebuttal, what portions of that testimony did you respond to in your sir rebuttal testimony?
Primarily, I tried to respond in sir rebuttal to Mr. Durkee's claim that my recommended savings levels and critiques of the MPS were biased and not based in evidence.
And how do you respond to his claim that your analysis was biased?
I disagree completely. The Commission required in 2020 that DESC evaluate programmatic changes in best practices to achieve those savings levels. And I think ICF, by its own admission, did not evaluate changes to programs, program design or program implementation that could have helped the portfolio reach those higher savings levels. My savings levels were based on several pieces of evidence, both what ICF put forward for the Commission required scenarios and the dozen other portfolios that I reviewed. And on top of that, I want to say, as I said at the outset, I've been managing and implementing programs for decades, and they were very high achieving programs. So the fact that programs under my leadership achieved high levels of savings does not indicate bias, it indicates experience.
Okay. Skipping ahead a little bit here. So did the higher savings levels that you recommended in your testimony, did they specifically derive from those other utilities?
No, they were based on the savings levels that were put forward by ICF, but they were the reality and achievability of those savings and reasonableness was, in my view, validated by the accomplishments of the other utilities.
Thank you. And is there anything else about Mr. Durkee's rebuttal that you highlighted in your sir rebuttal testimony?
Yes, the last thing and that I mentioned earlier, I don't understand why costs were assigned to levels of savings if ICF did not believe they were achievable. To me, that says that the costs, if something's not achievable at a certain level of cost, why not increase all the things that we've talked about? Do better marketing, do better outreach, perhaps increase the incentives. All that would increase the costs. But to put forward a cost that's associated with a specific level of savings, to me, says we've done this analysis and determined that this is cost effective at this level and achievable. Otherwise, I don't understand it. So I did mention that it's concerning to me. Doesn't really make sense, and certainly does not support the idea that DESC did that analysis. And it also raises some concerns about transparency. You know, how are interveners in the commission supposed to review the reasonableness of what was put forward if then in rebuttal they come back and say, well, that's not really what we meant. We didn't mean it was achievable. We just assigned these costs here to make sure that we were in compliance.
And so did the approach that you took, you tried to change as few factors as possible from Dominion and ICF's data. Is that right?
That's right. I relied on, in building what I thought was reasonable and achievable, I relied on those data from ICF and the commission required scenarios that showed there were higher levels of cost-effective savings that could be achieved.
Thank you, Mr. Gravatt. Chair Belzer, Mr. Gravatt is available for cross-examination and questions from the commission.
Thank you, Ms. Mixon. Sasiba?
Mr. Burns has questions.
Mr. Burns?
Yes, thank you, Chair Belzer. Sir, did you hear the testimony from Dominion witness, Ms. Shelton, yesterday?
Yes, I did.
Do you recall her saying that she isn't sure that energy efficiency can avoid new generation? Do you agree with that?
I definitely heard her say that. And there's a couple things I could say about that. I mean, there are different types of investments in, obviously, in delivering energy. There's generation, there's transmission, distribution. When I worked for Vermont Gas, we had aggressive DSM programs, and we worked with the planning department and deferred pipeline expansion, a gas transmission project, for a year, which saved customers a lot of money. And they made that deferral decision based on the amount of DSM savings we'd achieved in the programs. There have been other programs. There's a program that Con Edison in the New York area did a few years ago looking at deferring distribution investments, where they did aggressive targeted demand side management in areas where the load was growing because of customer growth. And interestingly, the program manager for that, they didn't end up making those investments. But what the program manager said is, the DSM gave us time to realize that we never had to make those investments in the first place. Had they not done that, ratepayers would have paid for those distribution investments that were not even needed. There are other examples. There's a planning, Vermont system planning project, which involves regulators, utilities, Efficiency Vermont, the efficiency provider, that came out of a transmission project in Vermont, the Northwest Reliability Project, that when that went in for approval, the regulator said, well, could we defer this investment through energy efficiency? And the answer was, maybe if we had a couple more years, but now it's kind of too late, we have to build it. And the regulator was furious and said, we're going to establish a process to make sure that you never come in here and ask ratepayers to pay for something that they wouldn't have had to pay for if you had done cost-effective energy efficiency. So that's now a fully implemented process. So there are a lot of examples of where energy efficiency has deferred utility investment.
Great. So you would disagree with Ms. Shelton's testimony, is that right?
I would disagree. I believe at the end she said she was not aware that DESC had ever, or DSC had ever deferred generation, which I have no information on. I don't want to dispute that, but it certainly is not
Understood.
the case broadly.
Did you hear her testify about dispatchable resources?
Yes.
Do you need to dispatch resources to meet load that is avoided through DSM or energy efficiency programs?
No, and it's an interesting use of language that I think we have here that sometimes causes confusion. If I can clarify, I will. There's, we talk about dispatchable resources and non-dispatchable resources. Non-dispatchable resources don't need to be dispatched because they're always there. And energy efficiency is a non-dispatchable resource. The savings from energy efficiency, the difference in energy use between a high efficiency heat pump and a standard efficiency heat pump, those savings are always there. You don't have to dispatch them. You don't have to tell the customer to do anything. And that's called non-dispatchable. They're always there. Dispatchable, more like demand response, where it requires a signal either from the utility through direct load control, like having a device that will turn down the heat or turn up the cooling temperature. And there are other dispatchable resources that are not direct load control, behavioral, peak time rebates, critical peak pricing, and so forth. But dispatchable is demand response, non-dispatchable is energy efficiency. And one isn't necessarily more valuable than the other. The non-dispatchable is perhaps more reliable in some ways because it's always there.
Well, if a load need is avoided through the use of those non-dispatchable resources that you testified to, you wouldn't need to dispatch the dispatchable resources to meet it because it's not there, right?
Exactly.
Would you expect to see customers invest on their own in DSM and EE at the same levels without an adequate utility program in place?
Well, I think that gets to the fundamental question of why would we have a utility program? And what it says is there are decades of research and understanding have shown is there are multiple so-called barriers, obstacles to customers doing it on their own. Because in some cases it makes economic sense. Oh, if I buy this more efficient heat pump, my bills over the next 20 years will be less. But the barriers are things like I don't have the information. I don't even know that I could save money by having a more efficient heat pump. And I noted Ms. Shelton said that their surveys, if I have the number right, that 58% of their customers were interested in the energy efficiency and the rest of them weren't interested. Well, they might not be interested because they might not know what the opportunities could be. So I think that's an important thing for programs to consider. But another common barrier is first cost. Mr. Durkee spoke this morning about what's different about South Carolina. Well, maybe, customers they're prioritizing their investments. And I would say, I work in a lot of jurisdictions. I don't think that's different about South Carolina. That's true everywhere. And so the role of a program is to provide information and some support, financial support through incentives, to bring that prioritization up a bit so that it induces them to make these purchases or investments that will reduce costs for the utility on the whole. And there's one more thing, if I may, that I want to say to that. Some customers are in a position to be making, prioritizing their investments between energy efficiency and the new deck. A lot of customers are in the position of trying to prioritize between food and paying their utility bill, between buying medicine or paying their utility bill. So that's a different level of prioritization, and that, for those customers, they're not considering whether to invest in energy efficiency because they flat out don't have the resources. So support from a program is necessary if anything is going to happen to reduce their bills.
Thank you. Finally, would you agree that DSM and energy efficiency can impact the type and amount of generation needed to reliably operate DESC's system?
Absolutely, and I personally cannot speak to DESC's system specifically, but energy efficiency and demand response, non-dispatchable and dispatchable resources reduce the required loads. And if the loads are required, then less, if the required loads are less, then fewer investments in the generation that's required to meet those loads is required.
So it's fair to say that demand side can affect supply side. The demand side resources used can affect the supply side resources that are required.
Absolutely.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burns. Office of Regulatory Staff?
No questions from ORS. Thank you.
Thank you. Dominion?
No questions, Chair Belzer.
Thank you. Commissioners? Commissioner Carolee Williams?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you for being here. I'm going to start piggybacking on another colleague's questions, and if they mind, I'm happy to turn it back over to them. But they were onto an interesting thought that has been discussed this morning, and that is there an end to what you can do with energy efficiency, with the increasing equipment, energy efficiency wise, with light bulbs? You've heard the discussion. Is there a new frontier out there for energy efficiency? How to do, and would either of my colleagues like to add to that question?
Go right ahead.
Okay.
Thank you for the question. I'll do my best to answer it. I think that when we look at utility programs, I mean, different utilities are in different positions with respect to how much opportunity there still is. And certainly changing federal standards, improved efficiency of equipment has an impact on how much potential there may be. But when I look at, let's, for example, look at a utility that's had very aggressive energy efficiency programs for years. Do they still have potential? Rhode Island in particular just released its draft 2024 electric energy efficiency plan, which is based on a 7-year potential study. I might note it's a bottom-up potential study that was done by Dunsky and Associates, different firm. That potential study identified something like 1.7 to 1.9% savings per year between 2020 and 27, and the 2024 plan proposes 1.4% electric energy efficiency savings. 1.4%. So, and this is for a utility that's been doing aggressive programs for at least a decade, if not longer. So if they don't think all the low-hanging fruit, well, let me change that. They probably do think all the low-hanging fruit is gone, but there's still fruit. And I've actually used this analogy in testimony in South Carolina before. But when people talk about low-hanging fruit and the low-hanging fruit's gone, I think of the apple orchards in Vermont where I used to live. And I think of all the apples that I can't reach but that I could get if I climbed on a ladder. And anybody who's trying to make a living by growing apples is not going to leave the high ones in the tree. That wouldn't make any sense. So there's still cost-effective savings. And it's true that the cost-effectiveness test in Rhode Island is different than here. But if we're saying here around 1/4 or 1/3% net, 0.5% gross savings is what we can get, and they're saying 3 to 4 times that, does the difference in cost effectiveness lead to that kind of difference? It's hard for me to accept that it does. So I think there's a lot of energy efficiency potential left. When we talk about homes, the impact that it can have, especially on struggling households, insulation and air sealing, that potential I think is vast. And if I may, if you'll indulge me, Ms. Shelton said that insulation and air sealing are invasive and expensive, and that's true. I supervised hundreds of retrofit jobs where insulation and air sealing was installed. And I can't think of a single household where those people said, man, that wasn't worth it afterwards. What they typically said was, this has materially changed the quality of my life to have this work done. I think of one person in particular who ran a childcare program whose kids were grown, and she was like, I can't afford to stay in my house anymore. and we did an insulation and air sealing project in her house. We reworked the ductwork. Her bills dropped less than half of what they were, and she could stay in the house. This is big benefit stuff that we're talking about, and I think that potential is still out there.
Do you think that those kind of programs need partners to make happen? And I think we've talked about state housing programs and maybe haven't mentioned local housing programs, but, this is an energy company.
Yeah.
What's the role of partnerships?
Well, I think, so your initial question was, do they require partnerships to happen? I'm not sure that they do. We didn't have much in the way of partnerships when I was at Vermont Gas, but they definitely can benefit from partnerships. I think, again, if we're talking about income-stressed households and we talk about the barriers that households face to participation, income-stressed households are trying to put food on the table. They're juggling it tends to be high stress in those households very often. So the idea of dealing with this program and that program and that program, all of which are offering a piece of a solution, can be pretty overwhelming. So one-stop shop is a term that's thrown around a lot in energy efficiency. Streamline the participation. I'll tell you, there was a pilot program that was done, I believe, in the Raleigh-Durham area. Triangle J, Council of Governments, and some other agencies, Agency on Aging, Weatherization, other folks, and they each had their own application processes and so forth, but they worked together so that whoever was at the house would get all the application data that all the programs needed. Mm-hmm. So the person wouldn't have to go through that over and over again, and it really streamlined participation.
So what I hear you saying is that for energy impoverished households, the frontier is there. There's an opportunity to make a difference. What about everybody else?
I still think there's opportunity. I think, equipment efficiencies, as long as there's baseline equipment, minimum code required, minimum federal standards, and more efficient equipment, there's an increment of savings there. And very often that increment of savings, it may not cost a lot of money for a utility to provide incentive to bump somebody up to the higher level. I think Mr. Durkee actually mentioned that this morning. There's Energy Star. Energy Star is higher than code, or maybe Ms. Shelton did yesterday about some appliances. I think that most of them are Energy Star, and that may be true. But if you look at the Energy Star website, they identify the most efficient. So in some cases, it's going to be cost effective to bump people up to that higher tier, which is going to reduce their bills, and it's going to reduce the demands for the grid. I think there's still opportunity. I think there's still behavior opportunity. I think there is...
Talk to me more about that.
So there are a lot of different kinds of behavior programs. Behavior programs, I've said this in a number of different places, the behavior programs where people get home energy reports and so forth, when you have several 100,000 customers participating, any one of those customers might not see a whole lot of bill savings, but in aggregate, it can have a pretty big effect, and that's really important when we're looking at grid management and resources. So I think those are valuable programs. They're not as valuable for helping individual customers manage high bills. There's another subcategory. I think we often look at households as a kind of everybody's the same. But if you look at usage patterns, there are some households who use a whole lot more energy than other households. In investigating why, there can often be real opportunities for those households, for example, and those businesses. They're operational, it could be called behavioral, but operational efficiencies can be available to businesses. Sometimes businesses, simple things like they just leave the cooling on or whatever. Simple things that they could do that would reduce their loads. There was one program I was involved with where they were doing, the commercial program was, the program manager was virtually watching the load profile. He would look at the data every morning, he would come in, and he would notice anomalies, and he would call them up and say, hey, what's going on? How come this? Now, it's a great thing when that kind of training can be provided to the businesses themselves and they can operate it, and those are real savings.
You mentioned ACEEE in your opening statements. You've heard my questions about ECEEE, and it's really getting at where is South Carolina in terms of energy efficiency, and how, how are we looking compared to especially others in the Southeast? And I drilled down earlier and said, what about North Carolina and Virginia, because Dominion's there as well. Can you offer any input, any insight in that?
There are a few things I can offer. I did, when I heard your question this morning, I looked at the ACEE's most recent state scorecard, and South Carolina was 49th. I also looked at the report Mr. Durkee referenced. The ACEEE has just released their updated utility scorecard, which is looking at the largest, about 52 utilities. And Dominion was 36, so not in the middle, kind of at the high end of the bottom third.
Did you happen to notice where Duke was?
I did not. I will say I have done work in Virginia and with the Dominion division up there, and they are increasing savings. And there is no question that the reason they are increasing savings is because the Virginia Clean Economy Act requires them to do so.
I'm glad you said that, since we don't have such.
Yeah, right. I think, it's certainly clear to me that requirements either in statute or regulation will drive higher savings.
Do you believe that ICF was competent and impartial in their work for this particular docket?
I don't have really any basis to form an opinion on that. I certainly think ICF is competent. I don't. I will say that, and I want to apologize. I know I was kind of going off script this morning. I have never been called biased so many times by a witness as Mr. Durkee did in his summary of his rebuttal testimony yesterday. So I am a little excited about that. So I apologize. I'm trying to keep myself calm. Mr. Durkee has a great deal of faith in his bottom-up analysis. I'm glad he does. I think a higher level of skepticism is appropriate. Kind of what I was saying before. When we learned how to do, math longhand, we had to be skeptical of the results and check them to make sure they made sense. So, again, that's sort of what I feel like I did in reviewing their results, and they don't make sense to me. I think Mr. Durkee and his team are very competent. I think they care about their work. I think they have a great deal of knowledge. But I am less convinced. I certainly don't agree that a bottom-up analysis is not biased and any other kind of review is biased. That I don't believe that at all. I think I trust actual evidence more than analysis. And there's no, to my mind, empiric evidence that says that a potential study that determines a level of achievable potential, that's actually the maximum. It's all based on the assumptions that go into it. And I also want to say, since we're on this subject, and since you asked, Mr. Durkee said many times that, well, that's not appropriate to include in a potential study. That's not normal to include in a potential study. There is no normal about a potential study. There is no industry standard. There's no regulation about what's included in a potential study and what's not included in a potential study. There is a scope of work that's determined between the contractor and the client. And that's what determines what's in the potential study. So in this potential study, it did not include some of the analyses that for instance, program enhancements. There's nothing that says you can't consider program enhancements, enhanced marketing. I've seen potential studies that do consider those things. So that's just the scope of work that was developed here.
And my last question, you talked in your summation a lot about an iterative process, and you just described kind of, the classic math testing. Is that what you mean by iterative? That you're testing and you're taking real information? What do you mean by your iterative?
I mean that, and I mean, let's use some assumptions and see what the output is. And do we believe that? Why if in this case, if the potential is lower than what I believe is achievable, why? Is there any room? Are there things we can change to get a better outcome? And my view is this is actually the utility's responsibility. If their responsibility is least cost reliable service delivery, they should be exploring all the options to deliver that at least cost. And that, to me, does not mean trying something, deciding that doesn't work, and checking off the box. It means iterating. It means trying different ways. This is what we've always done in program delivery. How can we make it better? How can we achieve more? How can we make our customers more satisfied?
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioners, further questions for the witness? Commissioner Caston?
Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam
Oh.
Chair.
Commissioner Irvin, go ahead.
Go ahead, Commissioner Caston, I'll follow up.
Thank you. I like sports, and one of the things I liked about sports, and also like sport analogies, and I'll try not to throw many at you, I promise. But one of the things, you know, when I hear ratings, rankings, and such, not that I don't think they mean anything, not that I don't think they matter, but I tend to question everything. The thing I liked about track was everybody was running against the same clock. Everybody. I don't care if you had 10 flights. The clock's all that mattered. So when I think about these things, I hear these, and I'm not saying they're not important because I don't know anything about them. But I do wonder, are we all running against the same clock? So I'd be interested in what are the inputs? What are you measuring? Is what's important to this state not important to that state? Those kind of things. So I just say that just because I thought about it when we were talking about it. Nothing more. Does that make sense?
Sure.
Have you, I guess, in the hearing heard, testimony about the utilities, electric utilities in particular, being able to recover program costs, incentives, and net lost revenue for these programs. And I don't know what other states do. They may have similar things, maybe more, maybe less. I don't know. I suspect you know more about that than me. Is that fairly standard? Is that unique here?
It's not unique here. There are plenty of states where utilities are allowed to collect net lost revenues. The amount of time that they're allowed to collect them varies from state to state. There are states where utilities are not allowed to collect net lost revenues. There are states where the utilities are decoupled, so it doesn't really affect their bottom line, how much energy efficiency there is or how much energy they sell. So there's a range of approaches.
Thank you. That was very helpful. I appreciate that. And a question I have, concern, whatever, thinking about these things is if the commission, approves energy efficiency programs, by statute, the utility is guaranteed these. I mean, that's the law. And you heard, I think, this morning throughout the hearing that, the demand is flat. The load is flat. And when I think about these things, and the questions Commissioner Carol Lee Williams was asking too, because I think about the same thing, like, where would you get it? I don't know anyone that would not think if there was a way to help those that can't insulate their homes and make them more energy efficient that wouldn't want to do that. Mm-hmm. But the bottom line is still the bottom line. Can the cost be recovered such that it's net zero or great advantage to all customers? Would you agree?
Yes, and I think that, if I may, specifically on that question, the utility cost test compares what the utility invests in energy efficiency programs against what it would have to invest in other resources. And if something is cost effective under the utility cost test, that says all ratepayers will benefit.
Well, I've heard that numerous times, but I've also heard from questioning that, at least from my perspective, and I believe there's multiple tests, and all tests are run, all the utilities run them, all should be considered. And I've read about those tests, I've seen the presentations on those tests, but I know that everything has assumptions that go into it. So again, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I am saying just because I'm told something doesn't mean it's, just because I'm told something doesn't mean that I understand it. Let me put it that way. I prefer to understand things. And so far, I've not seen, how do you do that? Let me see, let's go through that calculation. Have you been through the detailed calculations of all those tests involving the inputs, assumptions, and that stuff?
I have. The calculations themselves are pretty straightforward. The tricky part is figuring out what the avoided costs are. And that involves a lot of information from the utility and a lot of assumptions about the cost of other resources. So there are a lot of assumptions there. But I think I was very interested. I was just as late as yesterday afternoon, I was involved in a proceeding in Kentucky where I also proposed a higher level of energy efficiency savings. And the company said that's not cost effective. However, we put it in our model and it showed a PVRR savings of $51 million if we included it in our model. Well, that's cost effective, I think. So it wasn't cost effective based on the assumed avoided cost, but when looked at in a bigger picture, it was. So there are some approaches that other folks, my colleague Anna Sommer has sometimes talked about. Instead of this built-up, bottom-up modeling of avoided costs, what if we look at what's the cost of the next resource and can we defer it? And if we can defer it and we don't have to build it, then that's pretty significant savings and maybe a better indicator. But what we have most of the time is avoided costs and how they build up in this analysis. And I think they're still quite valuable, but they're questions.
And I think in the exchange with you and Commissioner Carol Lee Williams was, you know, the homes that need additional insulation or weatherization or to help make it more efficient is one thing, but just the everyday person, everyday home, you need, there's that thin margin, if there's a margin, because of the ubiquitous nature of, you know, just efficient everything. That's what I heard you guys talk about. Is that correct?
I think that's right. But there are things, you know, so does the utility provide a healthy incentive for households who are not income stressed? Maybe, maybe not. Does the utility do things to provide information, cost less than providing those incentives? Information, does the utility engage with community leaders who will stand up and say, I support energy efficiency. I urge all of you to support energy efficiency. There are still things that can be done to help make that priority rise up for folks.
When along those, well, I guess it's along those lines because I know I'd heard it in a previous hearing. I can't remember when. And I think Ms. Shelton kind of touched on it. We were talking about, I think she mentioned something about more energy efficient HVAC systems, heating, cooling. And if you go from the, say, 14 SEER to 16 or whatever, and there's pretty good price difference, it doesn't automatically fall into the, the customer's bill is going to be less and they use less electricity. If I understood her correctly, and I can't call her back, but I think because they were saying that I'm going to turn my thermostat down more, during warm days because it didn't cost me as much or as much as it used to. I'm going to turn it up more during the winter, and it would maybe balance out. Does that make sense, that statement?
Well, with all respect to Ms. Shelton, I would say there are, of course, some customers who are going to take some of their savings in improved comfort. But that is addressed in evaluation. So if the savings are evaluated, the evaluator will look at how many customers they're not real, they're getting more comfort instead of all the savings, and they adjust the overall program savings that way. I heard recently somebody said it's common that in low-income programs they take all the savings and comfort. And it's like, well, that's not true. There have been national evaluations of the low-income weatherization program that have shown savings across the board. So some customers will take some savings. Some customers may even take all of the savings and comfort, if you will. But if that were the norm, if that were widespread, then evaluation, I think, would identify that, and the programs wouldn't make sense.
Final thing, thinking about the HVAC, because I did get a more energy efficient one. And I actually probably fell in that category she was talking about, because I did turn the thermostat down more during the summer and it was cooler. And then I looked and said, okay, crap, I used about the same, but that was me. But it is more efficient. That said, the concept, I think, of the next thing, in other words, appliances, HVAC units are more efficient than they were 10 years ago, but if we could incentivize going to the next one up. I've heard, and I would suspect this makes sense to me, that if it's a $5,000 difference and the incentive is $400, most people, I would think, would struggle to do that. The ones that would do that would be the ones that could do that whether they got the $400 or not. Is that a true statement?
I would say that figuring out what the right level of incentive to apply in a program to a measure, there is some real art to that. And it does require paying attention to what happens. I mean, I've seen programs, probably 10, 12 years ago, New Jersey had a home performance with Energy Star, home retrofit program, and they wanted a lot of participation. So they offered to pay a 75% incentive and finance the rest at 0% interest. Pay 75%, the rest at 0% interest. And they had to close the program down after 3 months because they blew through the budget. So that was too aggressive. But it's similarly, if the incentives are too low, then there are going to be some people who are going to take it. They're going to make that decision anyway, and they'll just take the incentive. That doesn't really accomplish anything. So it's finding that sweet spot, and it changes. It's not something that stays the same as technology and the economy changes.
Well, thank you. Is it Gravatt?
Yes, it is.
Gravatt.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gravatt. I wanted to get it right. I appreciate it. And I really like your hair.
Thank you, Commissioner Cass. And I do want to tell you that both of my daughters ran on the state championship cross-country team when they were in high school. So
they know all about clocks, don't they?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Urban?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Gravatt, just to cut to the chase, I'd like to hear what you think about incentives for investor-owned utilities to participate in energy efficient and DSM programs. Has that worked in other jurisdictions?
Performance incentives for the utility based on their achievements, they have an opportunity to earn more. It has certainly worked in some jurisdictions. Again, I think any kind of incentive is something that requires a lot of careful thought, because you want to make sure that the incentive is actually leading to the behavior that you want. So, for example, there have been utilities that have had incentives that were based on first-year savings, first-year incremental savings. And so that those utilities would get as much savings as they could in the first year. There are others, Illinois, for example, that developed a performance mechanism based on what they call cumulative persisting savings, which is basically the longer the savings endure, which are the kind of savings you would get from insulation and air sealing or efficient HVAC equipment, stuff that's going to last for 20 years or more. The longer the expected life of the total savings, the more the company would have a right to earn. And I believe that that was tied to their allowable return. Like they would make a better return on the investment the bigger the number of cumulative persisting savings. I've also seen in Maryland, for example, with Empower Maryland, that's been around for 2008, they don't have performance incentives. But the regulators require the utilities to comply with the statute that says they have to get 2% savings every year. And they pretty much do. So I think there's some combination of rigorous regulation and performance incentive. ACEEE has done some studies. My recollection is that they have shown that performance incentives make a difference and can lead to higher savings. But I think that they have found that what they call an energy efficiency resource standard, either requiring a certain savings level, either by regulation or statute, may have a higher, a more meaningful correlation to higher levels of savings, if that makes sense.
Okay. So if you were hired as the expert to meet with the energy efficiency and demand side management working group, where would you start to design a program that would be attractive to both the investor-owned utility and to the ratepayers and others that are involved and affected?
That's a pretty challenging question on the fly. I'll do my best. I would spend some time trying to understand to the regulators and to the state by looking at statutes and regulation. What are the priorities? What does the state want to achieve through the energy efficiency programs? And
let's assume we have no statutes and no regulations, so we're kind of starting from ground zero.
Then I get to decide, right? So if there's no statute or regulation, I look to persisting savings. Specifically, when we're looking at the first sort of fundamental value that I talked about in demand side management, energy efficiency, demand response, is reducing system costs for customers. So persisting savings that can be relied on over time have, to me, a higher value generally than short-lived savings. So I would look to reward persisting savings. I would look to reward not the most cost-effective savings, but the highest level of cost-effective savings. So I've seen in some jurisdictions where programs aim for the most cost-effective, the savings I can get the most cheaply. That's the low-hanging fruit. And that leaves a lot of valuable investment on the table. So I would say let's focus on promoting as much cost-effective savings as we can get that's going to last as long. And then there's another metric that I actually advocated for in a Colorado proceeding this year, which is there's a lot of discussion about equity in utility commissions these days, and well, everywhere. And how do we decide what's an appropriate investment for reaching our most income-stressed households? And I think establishing a metric for what that is important, and I think it will lead to more benefits for those households. So I think those are probably the things that I would look at first. I think there are a lot of things that could be looked at here, and I would hope that there would be a lot more experts involved.
And so let's assume that we agree that on those metrics as starting a new program. How do we incentivize the investor-owned utility to participate? Is it through the avoided costs model, or is there a better model to incentivize them to, for example, partner to get some of these federal funds that are available to states and invest them locally and everybody wins. The ratepayers get lower bills, the utility gets, incentivized, by meeting certain, goals and metrics. How does that happen?
Hmm. I think if there is an incentive mechanism in place, when we look at things like the IRA, which is hopefully going to bring a lot of benefits to households and businesses, and where utility participation and support is going to make it easier potentially for those households and businesses to participate and receive some of those benefits. There's a question, and Mr. Durkee mentioned this question of attribution. Who gets credit for those savings if there's IRA funding and utility funding? And it may be that trying to negotiate a basis for the utility to get some credit for that up front will make them much more likely to want to participate and support their customers. I'd like to think that the utilities are going to say, this is important for our customers and we're going to do it because we think it matters. But I have heard enough utilities say, well, we're concerned about, is this going to hurt us on our savings targets because we're not going to get credit for the savings? I think it needs to be addressed. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does. And so are you aware of any jurisdictions that are following that model right now, considering it? I know the IRA is brand new, really, in a sense that Treasury has just issued regs on it. But is anybody in the planning process of doing something like that?
I think there's a lot of discussion. I'm not aware of, well, let me just say the jurisdictions in which I'm working, I'm not aware that there's been any concrete steps to kind of lay out how that's going to work, but there's certainly a lot of discussion. And I will note that in the settlement in the DEC rate case, there was a settlement requirement that Duke needs to come up with a plan to support its customers in achieving some of the, receiving some of the IRA benefits.
And do you recall, is that something you saw in one of our orders, or do you recall
Yes.
which proceeding it was?
Yeah, well, I'm sure council could remind me, but it was the DEC rate case in South Carolina. I provided testimony, and it was a recommendation that they support customers receiving these IRA benefits, and they agreed to do that in settlement, and then that was, finalized in the order from the commission.
Thank you so much for your answers. No further questions.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Commissioner Urban. Commissioners, further questions? Redirect?
No redirect. I did just want to make sure the record was clear. That was a Duke Progress.
Duke Energy Progress.
With DEP.
I apologize.
But no redirect.
Thank you, Ms. Mixon. Mr. Gravatt, thank you for your testimony today. Appreciate your time and your thoughts, and you may stand down.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Let's take about a 15-minute break, and then we'll go with your next witness. Is that okay? Thank you. We'll be back at 3:15. Thank you. Good afternoon, and we are back with the Public Service Commission in the hearing in docket number 2023-9-E. This docket concerns the 2023 Integrated Resource Plan for Dominion Energy South Carolina. Let's take a roll call of commissioners. Present in the hearing room, we have Commissioner Justin Williams, Commissioner Thomas, Commissioner Carolee Williams, Commissioner Caston, Chair Belser. With us virtually, we have Vice Chair Powers, Commissioner Irvin, Commissioner Irvin, let's stand at ease for a second. There we go. Let's see, we have Commissioner Justin Williams, Commissioner Thomas, Commissioner Carolee Williams, Commissioner Caston, Chair Belser, and Vice Chair Powers, and Commissioner Urban, the last two being virtual. Ms. Jaffe.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The Sierra Club, South Carolina Coastal Conservation League, and the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy would like to call Derek Stenslick to the stand.
Good afternoon, Mr. Stenslick. Good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you again as well, Chair.
If the court reporter will swear you in.
So raise your right hand, please. Do you swear affirm the testimony you're about to give to be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Ms. Jaffe.
Can you please state and spell your last name for the record?
Sure. Stenslick, Stenslik.
And who are you employed by and in what capacity?
I'm the founding partner of Telos Energy, a power systems analytics and engineering firm.
And did you cause to be prepared and pre-filed in this case 82 pages of testimony in both a public and confidential version on June 27th, 2023?
Yes, I did.
Did you have an opportunity to review that testimony?
Yes.
And do you have any changes or revisions to that testimony?
No, I do not.
If I were to ask you the same questions contained in your pre-filed direct testimony today, would your answers be the same?
Yes.
Madam Chair, I would move that Mr. Stenslick's pre-filed direct testimony in both public and confidential versions be entered into the record as given orally from the stand.
Mr. Stenslick's pre-filed direct testimony will be entered into the record. The confidential portions will remain under seal.
And did you also cause to be prepared and pre-filed in this case with your direct testimony 17 exhibits labeled as DS1 through DS17, 3 of which were marked confidential, DS6, DS10, and DS13?
Yes, I did.
And do you have any changes or revisions to these exhibits?
No, I do not.
Madam Chair, I would like to move into the record both the public and confidential exhibits attached to Mr. Stenslick's pre-filed direct testimony as a composite exhibit.
Mr. Stenslick's exhibits, which accompanied his pre-filed testimony and enumerated DS01 through DS17, will be a composite exhibit marked for identification as hearing exhibit 16 and received in the evidence of this case. The confidential exhibits will remain under seal.
And did you also cause to be prepared and pre-filed in this case 36 pages of surrebuttal testimony on August 15th, 2023?
Yes.
Did you have an opportunity to review that surrebuttal testimony?
Yes.
And do you have any changes or revisions to that surrebuttal testimony?
No, I do not.
If I were to ask you the same questions today, would your answers be the same?
Yes.
Madam Chair, I would move that Mr. Stenslick's pre-filed surrebuttal testimony be moved into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Mr. Stenslick's pre-filed surrebuttal testimony will be entered into the record as if given from the stand.
And did you also cause to be prepared and pre-filed in this case with your surrebuttal testimony 2 exhibits labeled as DS18 and DS19?
Yes.
And did these 2 exhibits correct a transcription error in Table 7 in your direct and correct a typographical error in Table 8 of your direct testimony?
Correct.
And do you have any changes or revisions to exhibits DS18 or DS19?
No, I do not.
Madam Chair, I would like to move into the record the public exhibits attached to Mr. Stenslick's pre-filed surrebuttal testimony as a composite exhibit.
Mr. Stenslick's exhibits DS18 and DS19 will be a composite exhibit marked for identification as hearing exhibit number 17 and received in the evidence of this case.
Thank you. Now, before we get to a summary of your testimony, can you please describe your education and training and provide the Commission a summary of what your current job entails?
Sure. My education, I have a bachelor's degree in international relations and political science and a master's degree in applied economics from Cornell University. My background is in power system modeling. Over the past 5 years, I founded Telos Energy, a small analytics and engineering consulting firm focused on grid modeling. And I've been doing that type of grid modeling for 10 to 12 years now.
Okay, thank you. And what clients do you typically work with?
Really a wide variety. I would actually say that environmental interveners, environmental advocacy groups are probably the minority of our clients. Most of the work we do is for utilities, independent system operators on the one hand, so grid operators. The second group is developers, either of wind, solar, storage, or transmission assets. And then the last group is really the research community, so working with Department of Energy, some of the national labs, folks like the Electric Power Research Institute, and so on.
And prior to founding Telos Energy, what was your work experience?
I worked for 8 years or so with General Electric in the power systems. I managed the power system strategy team and was in the power economics team. So working, doing similar grid modeling and consulting work across the electric power industry, really globally at that point. Most of that work, again, half of it, I would say, was external, working with grid operators across the country. The other half was actually internal to the GE businesses. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of need for that type of grid modeling within a company like GE. So worked very closely with the gas turbine product lines, the power generation services group that performs services on combined cycle and gas turbines, the renewables divisions, as well as energy financial services.
All right, thank you. And I believe you mentioned working with the Plexos software. How many years of experience do you have working with Plexos?
Yeah, I've been working with Plexos for 10 years now, and not just kind of an ad hoc basis, really day in, day out, multiple projects at a time using that software.
And do you have experience modeling transmission in Plexos?
Yes, I do, both at the nodal level, so looking at modeling every single transmission line, transmission bus, transformer, so looking at very detailed resolution, and we'll do that for large systems. We have a northeast model, and we perform studies for transmission developers that are looking to do multi-billion-dollar transmission investments in those areas. We also do it at the zonal level, so sometimes if you don't do the nodal topology in the model, you can still do a zonal one where you make a simplification and model the major interfaces in that tool.
All right, thank you. Madam Chair, at this time, based on Mr. Stenslick's extensive experience and qualifications, as also laid out in his CV attached as Exhibit DS1 to his direct testimony, we would request that he be qualified as an expert witness in power system planning and reliability.
Any questions of voir dire of Mr. Stenslick related to his expertise? State that again, please. I write very slowly.
Qualified as an expert in power system planning and reliability.
Hearing no questions, we will accept Mr. Stenslick as an expert witness in power system planning and reliability.
Thank you. Mr. Stenslick, to avoid redundancy, did you prepare a combined summary of your direct and rebuttal testimony?
I did.
And can you please read that for the commission?
Yes. Good afternoon, and thank you for your time today. My name is Derek Stenslick, and I'm the founding partner of Telos Energy, an analytics and engineering firm specializing in power system planning, resource adequacy studies, and renewable integration. Over the past 10 years, I've supported utility, grid operator, and renewable energy developer clients across the power industry with detailed power system modeling similar to the analysis conducted by Dominion Energy South Carolina, or the company. This is my third time speaking in front of the commission on behalf of Sierra Club, along with the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy and the South Carolina Coastal Conservation League. Since 2019, I've provided expert testimony on or supported comments in several proceedings, including avoided cost dockets, integrated resource plans, and the coal retirement study here in South Carolina. I also participated continuously throughout the IRP stakeholder process. And my colleagues and I worked diligently through that time to evaluate the company's proposals, critically analyze their inputs and assumptions, and I hope to provide a different perspective for the commission and the company's ratepayers. I hope this perspective is a valuable contribution to the proceeding, and I welcome your questions. I submitted both direct and rebuttal testimony in this case. The purpose of my testimony is to review and evaluate various components of the company's 2023 Integrated Resource Plan. My review identified several inputs and assumptions that should be considered. I also conducted independent modeling to quantify the benefits of alternative resource plans to the ones proposed by the company. Finally, my testimony recommends that the Commission take actionable steps to retire coal generation and replace it with modern, clean, and flexible technologies in order to reduce costs and mitigate risks of future environmental policies. Before I summarize the findings from my review, I would like to clarify to the Commission a few false comments and statements the company has made about my testimony, despite correcting them in my rebuttal testimony. First, I did not make any changes to the capital cost assumptions for any resources modeled by the company beyond allowing some units to receive bonus tax credits which were readily available in South Carolina. I use the same NREL source as the company for battery storage and solar costs. Second, the company continues to make a false assertion that I assumed the IRA benefits continue indefinitely. This is not true. I use the same 2034 IRA sunset schedule that the company assumed, despite it being a conservative one. Despite assertions made by the company, I use the same capacity factors and solar profiles used by the company. And lastly, fourth, I also assumed the same transmission upgrade costs assumed by the company in my core portfolios when Williams is retired. This does not mean I agreed with those assumptions, but I tried to change as little as possible in the model to make sure comparisons between my results and the company's were straightforward and easy to follow. Now to summarize my findings from this review. The company did not adequately consider lower cost clean energy options in the IRP. Instead, the company had a singular focus on a large gas combined cycle resource to replace Williams. Simply put, while the company may claim their modeling showed that gas resources were the least cost option, they did not provide the model any other viable options. Both solar and storage resources were considered in ways that even when the builds were maxed out in the model, which they were, there was not enough available to fully replace both Williams and Wateree. Battery storage, for example, was limited to 800 megawatts from 2029 to 2036, an insufficient amount to replace coal capacity. By limiting solar and storage, they left no other option to meet system needs other than a large gas resource. There are two ways to use models. The first is to use modeling to inform decision-making. The second is to use models in an effort to support decisions that have already been made. And I believe the company's IRP did the latter. In addition, there are several inputs and assumptions that bias the results in favor of the company's preferred plan. The company used the wrong heat rate assumptions for new gas resources, discounting fuel costs by over 10% or about $20 million per year for the new shared combined cycle. While the company now recognizes that this was a mistake, I disagree that it is inconsequential to the final results. It was also an issue that was raised in January during the stakeholder process when asked to review inputs and assumptions, which the company did not internalize. The company also assigned transmission upgrades necessary for a new plant at Candidus to the retirement of Williams rather than the new gas resource. In doing so, they did not adequately consider alternative options to reduce over $300 million of proposed transmission upgrades. Most importantly, the company did not fully consider opportunities from the Inflation Reduction Act. The IRA is a unique opportunity for the company and its ratepayers. In short, federal incentives will pay between 30 and 50% of the cost of new clean energy resources. Why should ratepayers pay 100% for a new gas resource when they can get a 30 to 50% discount on new solar, storage, and other clean energy technologies? The company's modeling is simply leaving money on the table. The company failed to account for bonus credits and was conservative in their assumption that the IRA will sunset at the earliest possible date. The tax code states that the IRA benefits sunset at a pre-specified date or when the country meets ambitious CO2 reduction goals, whichever comes later. All third-party analysis I have reviewed suggests the IRA expiration will be delayed until these emissions reductions are met. Despite this, I continue to use the same conservative assumption as the company that the IRA sunsets at the earliest possible date in my modeling. The company has tried to discredit my testimony, and much of their opposition is based on two claims: cost and reliability. The company claims that the costs for solar and storage have increased significantly and that my modeling results do not capture this. I would like to remind the Commission of two things. First, my analysis used the same capital cost assumptions as the company. To be very clear, I did not model cheaper costs for solar and storage. Second, it is not just the cost of solar and storage that have increased. We have all felt the sting of inflation firsthand over the past 2 years, and the entire power industry is experiencing this too. Supply chain disruptions and increasing interest rates are affecting everything from new transformers to transmission, battery storage to gas turbines. Mr. Walker and Mr. Parker's testimony this week has corroborated that finding. Supply chains will correct themselves and production will increase further due to the IRA investments. With these changes, it is likely that costs will start to go down as well. My modeling shows that solar and storage replacement of Williams is lower cost than the company's preferred portfolio, even when accounting for full transmission upgrade costs that the company states is necessary to retire the Williams coal plant. The company also tries to claim that my modeling would have selected a large gas resource in 2031. However, that is true if the model is constrained to only build the shared resource in that year, giving a false use it or lose it resource candidate to the model. If the model is allowed to build the resource in any year, it chooses to build the solar and storage first and defer new gas capacity until 2038. The company's second claim is that the system cannot be reliable without a new gas resource. This is simply not the case. Solar and battery storage are mature technologies and can provide a wide range of grid services, from frequency response and voltage stability to fast ramping and firm capacity. When the system is designed correctly, battery storage can provide a meaningful contribution to the planning reserve margin and be a reliable replacement to both Williams and Wateree. I would like to remind the Commission that my portfolio still leverage existing gas resources for reliability. The results of my modeling and that of expert witness Chelsea Hoteling show that my alternative portfolios can meet or exceed the 1 day in 10-year loss of load expectation reliability requirement. Unlike the company, we confirm that our portfolios could perform reliably across a wide range of weather, load, and generator outage conditions. Lastly, the company claims that the earliest feasible retirement date for Williams is 2030 due to a long lead time of new transmission as a long pole in the replacement process. However, the company did not adequately evaluate transmission or generation alternatives like battery storage, synchronous condensers, STATCOMs, and other options. While they state that my portfolio would not mitigate transmission needs, they simply never evaluated a full battery replacement at Williams, despite regular requests in the stakeholder group and the coal retirement proceeding. In addition, the company modeled a replacement resource at Candidus that was significantly larger than the previous coal plant at that site and refused to assess a smaller addition at that location or no additions at all. Uncertainty and costs of replacement resources, transmission needs, and future reliability will persist until a final decision is made on the retirement of Williams and Wateree. While 2030 may seem in the distant future, in the power system planning world, it is right around the corner. Decisions and actions need to be made in this IRP, not future ones, in order to start the replacement process and ensure that options remain available in the future. Continued delays, on the other hand, could close the door to replacement options, may miss significant opportunities available from the IRA, and potentially jeopardize reliability. I hope the outcome of this IRP can provide clear guidance to the company, stakeholders, and customers on next steps for the coal replacements. I would like to again thank the Commission for their time today, and I'm happy to answer any questions related to the IRP, mine modeling, or alternative considerations. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Chair, the witness is now available for cross.
Thank you, Ms. Jaffe. Sasiba?
Mr. Burns.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Burns?
Didn't mean to step on you there, Mr. Witt. Thank you. Mr. Stensler, good afternoon. I asked some questions yesterday of the company's witness, Mr. Neely, that focused on a number of the modeling decisions made by the company in its IRP. Were you able to watch that discussion?
Yes, I was here for that discussion.
All right. Two primary areas of concern related to the annual interconnection limits that Dominion assumed in its modeling and the limited availability of storage capacity prior to 2036. You have filed testimony, I believe, on both of those issues. Is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. Well, given those modeling choices made by Dominion, can you explain what implications those choices had for replacement options within the model for the Williams coal plant?
Yeah, sure. I touched on this in my summary testimony, but happy to elaborate on this further. Essentially, what we see in the model is 2031 or 12/31/2031 is a key date in the model. That's after the retirement of both Wateree and Williams. So at that point, the system becomes deficient of the reserve margin and needs more capacity available to serve load and meet reliability needs. And so really, it's all about what can the system get on between now and that 2031 date. And in the model, while the company says there are multiple options, multiple resource candidates, they limited the availability of how much solar could be added. So we talked a lot in great length over the past couple of days about that 300 megawatt per year solar addition. And so solar is very valuable for providing some of the lost energy that went with the coal plants. But we haven't touched on as much as the battery storage constraints. And so in the model, it was set up that there are three types of battery storage resources. 4-hour duration resources, which were split into two pieces to show that as you add more storage, the ability for it to provide firm capacity diminishes. And so I think Dominion did the right thing by splitting that 4-hour storage into two pieces. Basically, the first editions got a certain amount of capacity credit. The next editions got a lower capacity credit. The issue was that the second tranche was not available to the model until 2036. And so the first tranche was 800 megawatts was available at any point between 2029 and 2036, but 800 megawatts wasn't enough to replace both Williams and Wateree with capacity. So essentially the model had to look for somewhere else. If Williams and Wateree were both going to be retired, it had to look to another resource in order to add something. And frankly, when I picked up the IRP at the beginning, I flipped to, I could look at the appendix here, but there's an appendix table that shows the capacity builds by year. And what you'll see in that table is every year you see the solar limit get hit. Let me find that table.
Yeah, what table is that?
Yeah, hold on a second. It is on page, the reference build plan starts on page 109 that's of the original IRP. I don't have the revised one. So it's Appendix E, timing and nature of resource additions and resulting capacities. But the table will be the same in the revised IRP. So under the reference build plan, you see starting in 2028, all the way through 2036, it's building 300 megawatts a year every year. And, you know, right away when I saw that, that's a red flag to me. Whenever I see the same exact amount being built every year, that raises kind of a red flag. I say, well, what's going on there? Turns out there's the solar capacity build. It's not mentioned in the IRP at all, but if you have the model, you can look into that. It was also discussed in the stakeholder working group, so it wasn't a surprise in this case. I believe we found that in the coal retirement study first. But yeah, whenever you see that every year building the same amount, you know that's a constraint in the model, and it's pretty clear that if that level is higher, it would be selecting more resources.
You mentioned the stakeholder process. Did you know whether during that process stakeholders raised concerns about that limit?
Yeah, this came up routinely during the stakeholder process. So several stakeholders raised it as a concern. Both CECIBA and the environmental interveners raised that concern. There was discussion, but ultimately no change to that limit.
Thank you. Please, had you finished discussing the effect on the Williams replacement?
I think I did, but I'm happy to go into further detail.
No, that's fine. That's fine. You did a proposed alternative. Well, let me go back to the 300 megawatt limit and the limitation on storage. Did Dominion include any similar megawatt limitations in the modeling of other resources, such as natural gas, in their preferred portfolio?
No, certainly no limits that were binding in the model. So technically in the model, you have to put a minimum and maximum. Otherwise, you just give too many options available to the model. So there might have been limits placed on other resources, but none of them were binding, right? So it never built as much as it could of a resource and then had to switch on to another one. That was only for solar and storage.
I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Nope,
Go ahead.
sorry. That was only for solar and storage.
Okay, great. Thank you. Your proposed alternative portfolio replaces Wateree and Williams with storage and solar resources. Is that right? Primarily with those two resources?
Yes, that's correct. We also had a portfolio that looked at adding energy efficiency as well.
Okay. Now, as witnesses discussed yesterday and the day before, solar can be considered an intermittent resource, while storage is a dispatchable resource, but it's also time limited. Would you agree with those limitations on storage and solar?
You know,
those descriptors?
Yeah, yes and no. I think I always have a little bit of problem with some of the terminology that gets thrown around. So the first is around intermittency. I prefer to use variability, or their variable resources. It's a nuance, but intermittency implies that it's completely uncontrollable. You don't know when things are going to come on or come off. Typically, the industry will use variable resources, and the difference there is it's very predictable. Our forecasts have gotten much better. We know when the solar is going to be there. We know when it's going to drop off. We can prepare the system for it. So it's not a shock to the system when we have that variability. So a little bit of a nuance on that terminology. On the dispatchability one, so I'd actually argue that solar can be dispatchable if you wanted to. So you can provide dispatch signals to the solar resource. They can follow commands from the control room. So again, if the solar is not there, you can't dispatch it up, but you can always control its output. And that's important. You can use it to put ramp rates on the system if you need to. They can provide reserves. And actually, both solar and storage can follow those signals faster and more accurately than a conventional thermal resource, whether it's gas or coal.
And there's currently on the market today program or control programs that allow that sort of rapid response?
Yes, absolutely.
And that in use in solar facilities in the Carolinas?
I do not know about solar projects in the Carolinas. You know, a lot of the ones in Dominion service territory are PURPA facilities, so I just don't know about whether or not they're being actively dispatched by the utility. But yes, any modern solar or storage technology can follow dispatch signals from the utility.
Now, you may have heard from Dominion witness Neely yesterday that in order to replace Williams, the company needed capacity resources added to its system that could operate for days or even weeks at a time. Do you recall that testimony?
I do.
Given your proposed portfolio, the portfolio that you analyzed, I assume you disagree with his conclusion.
Yes, I do disagree with the conclusion. I'm not trying to say the system doesn't need any resources that can be dispatched for continuous days at a time or for long periods of time. What I would say is the system has sufficient resources available installed today, even without Williams and Wateree, to manage that continuous need. So it's really about what do we need additionally. And in terms of the additions, our modeling has shown that solar resources, variable solar resources, plus energy storage, either at 4-hour duration or 8-hour duration, is sufficient energy duration, sufficient response to be able to maintain reliability and be needed when available. Again, I don't think we're at a point where we can go whole hog and move away from any kind of what you'd call for lack of a better word, a firm or always available resource, or always a continuously dispatchable resource. But in terms of new additions for the Williams and Wateree, I do think there's sufficient resources on the system already.
Can you explain, based on the work that you and Witness Hoteling performed, why you are confident that solar and storage can meet those system reliability requirements even when Williams is retired?
Yeah, great. So Mr. Wintermantel testified yesterday about the SERVM modeling and how he conducted that to really assess the contributions of solar and storage to providing firm capacity. So again, we know with solar, for example, it's not always available, but we know statistically it will be available at times when it's needed. And again, with battery storage, we know it can't always be available, but we can assess, is it available when we really need it? And so that's what that SERVM modeling is doing. It's looking across 42 years of weather. So when we looked at the solar profiles, there's 42 years of solar profiles that took into account year to year, hour to hour variability in the solar resource, and made sure that the storage resources, if it was needed, it could only be available for the hours that it has in its duration. So a 4-hour resource could only provide a response for 4 hours at a time, or it could spread it out across that same amount of energy across more hours if it needed to. But importantly, we also made sure that the energy was available to charge those battery resources across those 42 weather years and all sorts of generator outages and load conditions. So we performed similar analysis to what Mr. Wintermantel presented yesterday on the actual portfolio that we proposed. So we took that portfolio, evaluated it in the SERVM modeling, and confirmed that, again, as Mr. Wintermantel said, we couldn't cover every possible reliability risk, but we could get below that 1 day in 10-year loss of load expectation, so an adequate level of reliability.
Thank you. Do you recall testimony yesterday from Mr. Neely concerning where he testified about the specific transmission needs of the Charleston area affecting his analysis? Do you recall that testimony?
Yes, I do.
Are you aware of whether or not any transmission impact analysis has been done by Dominion to evaluate the impacts of your proposed portfolio
No.
in the context of the Charleston transmission system?
No, they did not evaluate our proposed portfolio. And frankly, they didn't evaluate a portfolio that was even similar in nature to our portfolio, despite this being a request throughout the stakeholder process in both the coal retirement study, kind of as the TIA was kicking off, and in the IRP. So we proposed evaluating the role of a like-for-like, I shouldn't say like-for-like, an equal replacement to Williams with battery storage, so 600 megawatt resource at the Williams site or close by. It doesn't necessarily have to be physically sited, but it would make sense to use a brownfield that has the transmission interconnection. They also didn't evaluate a proposal that did not include an oversized gas plant at Canadas. So when they talk about a $300 million transmission upgrade, some of that is due just because the Canadas coal plant that used to be there was 450 or just below 500, and now they're evaluating a 1,300 megawatt gas resource. So of course there's going to be transmission upgrades that go along with that. So some portion of that is attributed to the large gas resource, not necessarily the retirement of Williams. The other piece, they did, after several requests, evaluate a partial replacement to Williams with battery storage. So they evaluated up to 300 megawatts of battery storage, and the findings were interesting. It showed that that $300 million transmission upgrade could be reduced to 200 megawatts or $200 million. So obviously a benefit there of the battery storage, again, being able to be sited at Williams. Lastly, my proposal, proposed portfolio, I'm not saying there's not going to be any needed transmission upgrades on the system. Certainly, Williams is in a strategic location on the grid right next to the load center. You'd suspect there'd be some transmission upgrades needed to get there. I don't think I do think a portfolio of solar storage, energy efficiency resources could significantly reduce the necessary transmission upgrades. There's also other options like synchronous condensers at the Williams site that weren't evaluated. Basically, a synchronous condenser is you could actually take the Williams coal plant, you could take off the steam turbine with it and just keep the generator and spin that, and it would basically provide a lot of that voltage stability, a lot of the grid strength that Williams is providing today, just without the fuel that goes into it, right? You're not burning coal, it's just the generator spinning. Not saying that would necessarily mitigate all of the risk, but it's certainly something that you'd want to consider if you're taking a large coal plant out of a load center like that.
Would a TIA or transmission impact analysis of that alternative portfolio be a logical next step for Dominion to take in its evaluation of the Williams retirement, in your opinion?
I think so. Certainly before making any decisions on a replacement resource, I'd want to see what that transmission need looks like and how that would work.
Thank you for your time. I have no further questions.
Thank you.
Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Burns. Office of Regulatory Staff?
No questions, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Huber. Dominion?
No questions, Chair Belzer.
Thank you. Commissioners?
Madam
Commissioner
Chair.
Caston?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And good afternoon, Mr. Stensler.
Good afternoon.
In your direct testimony on page 5, lines, 12 through 18, but question was, please identify the documents and filings on which you base your opinions.
Sorry, you said it was on direct on
Yes.
page 5?
Yes, sir.
And what was the question again? Sorry.
Well, I want to make sure that these are the things that your opinion was based on the review of these materials here that you reference on those lines.
Yeah, let me just check. Yeah, so I reviewed the testimony of all the parties, or at least all the parties that were related to the Plexos modeling and the transmission upgrades and the energy efficiency. Reviewed the Office of Regulatory Staff proposal, the NREL ATB, and also the model itself is very valuable. So yes, reviewed that as well.
And the reason I asked that, because it wasn't a trick question, I really wanted to. I was looking to see if I just missed it. Did you perform any kind of engineering analysis or transmission modeling or anything like that in addition to this?
No, I wish we could have. That's something that my firm does do from time to time. So I did consult with a couple of my colleagues that do have expertise in transmission modeling and the same AC power flow tools. So we did review a lot of that in the TIA studies itself and looking at kind of the one-line diagrams and all that.
I understand. And I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. If you don't agree, you don't agree. If you do, you do. Would you agree that an analysis such as these should be done before retiring a major facility?
Absolutely. Yeah, best practice would be you need to do that.
That's all I have.
Okay.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Mr. Stenklick, I just have a couple of questions. With regard to your alternate portfolio and your recommendations of Williams and what is being proposed in the IRP for Kennedy's, you realize that 1,300 megawatt is a shared resource with Santee Cooper.
Yes, I do. I was just referring, when I mentioned 1,300 megawatts, I was just referring to the size of the plant going in at that location being significantly larger than the previous one. So yes, not.
But it is, as being discussed, a shared resource for two utilities.
Right, but correct. But the transmission upgrades would still be needed to get to that size, regardless of.
And in response to your question, or question from Commissioner Caston, did you do an independent model? Did you run the model?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
So, yeah.
I must have misunderstood what I thought you had, and I thought you were responding to him that you didn't do your own model.
Yeah. Thank you. So let me clarify. There's two types.
I may be wrong.
Yeah, no. Thank you for asking the question so I could clarify, Chair. There's two types of modeling that was done. Most of the work in the IRP was done in Plexos. So that was the capacity expansion planning, which is selecting the different resources, and the short-term production cost, which is really coming up with what is the fuel cost, how does the system operate. So that we absolutely did our own independent analysis. We use the same Plexos tool. The second was
the transmission.
The transmission, Witness Parker, what he referred to. So that's a different modeling tool. And essentially what that does, it's looking at snapshots in time and looking at the details of the transmission flows across the system and really looking at contingency analysis. So if you lost a transmission line, how do the flows on the network change? One thing I did propose, so right now that's kind of two independent tools completely in Dominion's work. One thing I discussed about the stakeholder process is how to get a better representation of that transmission, because there's a big transmission need getting into Charleston. And yet in the Plexos model, it's not represented at all. Right? And so when the Plexos is selecting different resources, it doesn't know, should I cite a resource at Candidus? Should I cite it at Williams? Should I cite it at Wateree? In Plexos, it's just what we call a copper sheet. It doesn't look at the transmission topology the way Dominion has it set up. There are ways to get transmission in that topology embedded directly into the Plexos model. I'm not saying it should replace those other tools that Witness Parker and the work conducted in the TIA, but it is really important to, at least if there's a significant transmission constraint like the one in Charleston, to at least get that reflected in Plexos itself.
And when you use the same inputs when you ran the Plexos model for the generation part, or the portfolios? You ran most of the same inputs as Dominion did. Is that correct?
I would say most of the same.
Except the ones you've identified.
Correct.
In your
Yes.
testimony.
Except for the ones that we identified.
And that would include. You're aware that there's tremendous growth in the Charleston in the Low Country area. Are you aware of that? And does that take that into account?
So we assume the same load growth as Dominion. No changes.
And you assume. And does that take into account? We've heard testimony that there are, and this may be more on the transmission side, multiple interconnections with Santee Cooper's system down there, because they're right next door to each other and in and out each other. So
absolutely. So our model used the same topology as the companies. So we only modeled Dominion's footprint. It is something I've flagged in the past that really with that level of interchange and kind of how everything's right on top of each other, Dominion can model neighbors. That is normal in IRPs to model not just their system, but to make sure they're getting those flows correct. But we use the same topology, just modeled Dominion service territory. Like I said before, I'm not trying to advocate that no transmission needs would be required, once Williams is taken offline. But I do think there are other options that could accelerate the time frame of the replacement resources and potentially reduce costs.
And I think you indicated that a transmission analysis would be the next logical step to be conducted for the alternative portfolio that you've recommended?
Yeah, that would be fair. I do think having a portfolio that doesn't have a large gas resource at Candidus and sees what the transmission needs would be and looks at, again, alternative solar storage and other technologies and to see what transmission upgrades would be required. Because again, I do agree there would be some transmission upgrades required. It's just a matter of what and how many. And just a reminder, the company isn't proposing to site anything in Charleston or at the Williams site either. So when they had claims that there needs to be a dispatchable resource, with Williams gone, Williams is being taken out. There's no generation resource being proposed to replace it at Williams. So again, you would need transmission, but it's not necessarily needed there.
Okay. And tell me where you grew up.
Upstate New York.
Okay.
So.
I'm going to give you a lesson in Southern. It's Canadays.
All right, thank you. Canadays.
Thank you, Mr. Stenklick. Commissioners, questions? Commissioner Carolee Williams? Oh, Commissioner Irvin, did I hear you?
Yes, ma'am.
Please go ahead.
Thank you. Sir, you mentioned that you see a need for a TIA or transmission study. Is that your testimony?
Yeah, that's a portion of it, to look at a portfolio in the TIA that, again, does not require gas resources and leverages solar and battery storage instead.
How much time would it take to get that transmission study completed and the results available to the commission?
Yeah, that would be a better question for Witness Parker. I know they have worked through, now they're on their third TIA probably in the last year, and each one of those has 4 or 5 different cases included in it. So,
Well, give us a ballpark estimate.
yeah, I'd say a couple months.
Okay.
A few months.
Would that be a hardship to require such transmission study?
I don't think it would be a hardship. Like I said, the company's already evaluated 12 or 15 different configurations of different resources. I think one thing that will be a little different is, again, battery storage and solar, different resources than maybe what they're accustomed to modeling in the transmission. So making sure things like, the big thing that comes up with battery storage is certainly the resource has to charge. And so what are the assumptions on when that charges, and when are the assumptions of when it discharges, what's happening on the rest of the system? So there's a lot of details. I would not say it's a hardship, but there's new details in how the inverters are set up in the model, how the battery is dispatched, that would just have to be thought through. But yeah, similar analysis to what was done before.
Right, and I had asked Witness earlier, since Dominion Energy South Carolina owns the Williams site, it seems logical that they would try to find a use for it even after the coal generation is retired. And since they have transmission hookup on the site, wouldn't that be an ideal place for battery storage?
Yes, I believe so. Like you said, there's already a transmission infrastructure there. It's in a strategic location on the grid, close to the Charleston Load Center. So I agree, that's one option. The good thing with battery storage is you would want to spread it around the service territory. You don't have to put it all in one place like a gas resource. So some certainly to Williams would make sense. But again, one of the benefits being able to split up the battery storage, move it across the service territory would make sense.
Do you see that move saving ratepayer costs that would be passed on otherwise?
Yeah, certainly the transmission interconnection would get used. So if all things considered, a battery storage development on a greenfield site that would require all new transmission infrastructure and interconnection would probably most likely be more expensive than a battery storage located at a site that already has the transmission infrastructure. It's a brownfield, so you don't have to buy new land or set up the land. Not certain, obviously decommissioning a coal plant is not easy either. So that's something that would have to be looked at, but it would make sense to reuse some of that. And even in Dominion's plan, there are significant battery additions in their plan as well. So regardless of the plan, it would make sense.
Should that same transmission study consider the adjoining interconnection with Santee Cooper, as Chair Belser suggested? Is that something that needs to be done at the same time?
Yes, and that's being considered in the TIA studies that have been performed to date, that the company has already performed. But yes, you would have to take into account the interchange with Santee Cooper and other neighbors.
Thank you. No further questions.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Irvin. Commissioner Carolee Williams.
Thank you, Chair Belser. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You talked about the need to plan in terms of the IRA funding being available. This may be beyond your expertise, but is that something that could potentially change a year from now with the new president?
Anything could change with a new administration. Anything could change in terms of politics and laws that are on the books. I will say that the IRA has been beneficial to all states. There's been a lot of manufacturing that has come here to South Carolina because of the IRA, to a lot of Republican states for battery manufacturing, wind, solar manufacturing. A lot of that has gone to red states. And also in terms of where the bonus credits are, a lot of those are in coal communities, so there's favorable representation. So sure, anything can change with the new administration. Oftentimes these types of incentives are tough to pull back once they're put in place, especially if there's considerable multi-billion-dollar investments in manufacturing going on in across the country.
I'm recalling that the replacement for Wateree would involve an all-source RFP. Stop me if I'm wrong about that, but would that not allow for enhanced battery and other options to be considered?
Yes, to the best of my knowledge, based on the testimony we heard earlier this week from Ms. Best, the company's considering an all-source procurement for Wateree, and the company's own plans up so far are proposing or seeing that battery storage and solar right now under the conditions they evaluated are the least cost options for replacing Wateree. So under their analysis, that's consistent, and an all-source procurement would allow the different resources to compete against one another. I think the important thing on all-source procurements, it's all about how you set it up, right? The requirements that you put. So if you say in the all-source procurement, we'll take any resource if it's available for 12 hours consecutively, well, not all resources can provide that. So it's really about how you set up that all-source procurement. Typically what you'll see in states is there's an energy component in terms of megawatt hours. We need a certain amount of energy for this procurement to replace megawatt hours of energy from Wateree. And then you would see a capacity component, which is a certain amount of firm megawatts to replace it. And certainly different resources will get counted differently on their firm megawatts, but relative to nameplate. But yeah, usually you'll see it broken up like that. The thing you have to be careful about is other things that slip into the all-source, kind of the requirements that preclude different resources. And I just one more thing to add there. We did hear a couple days ago from Ms. Best that they're now considering a single source procurement for the Williams retirement. So in that case, you would not be able to get all resources on the table to replace that resource.
Okay. And we talked about this earlier. Appendix E, page 109. Actually, I think it's of the original and the revised RFP. And you talked about the 300 megawatts of solar, and that's an indicator that there's some parameter in the Plexus model that's stipulating that.
Yep.
I noticed right below that the 150 from 2037 to 2049. Is that indicative of anything? I know it's outside of this IRP. It's probably something I vaguely remember some testimony on, but just a point of curiosity.
I believe, and this was spoken about yesterday by Mr. Neely, the company modeled two types of solar resources, company owned and third party owned. And so the third party owned was 150 megawatts a year. The company owned was 150 megawatts a year. So my guess is what's happening there is it doesn't need all the solar. And so it's picking the cheaper solar, and it's maxing out the cheaper solar from the third party. And it's saying, well, that company owned isn't worth it. So don't build that. Just build as much as you can of the cheaper solar. Don't build the more expensive solar.
I need to check to see if what I heard was what you were saying in terms of the Plexus model and the ability to integrate transmission analysis as part of it. What I'm wondering is if that's at all in the right direction. I want you to correct me if it's in the wrong direction, but is that something that we might identify for addressing in an upcoming IRP?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for asking that question. So Plexos does have powerful transmission capabilities. This is something we brought up at the stakeholder meeting. I even offered to help Dominion set up some of the transmission, either interfaces or nodal, if that was something that they were interested in. So yeah, the model, like I said, it could either have a nodal configuration, and again, in that you're modeling every single bus on the system, every interconnection point, all of the transmission lines, and all of the transformers. And what you can do with that is an N-1 security constrained economic dispatch. So it's essentially very similar to what the utility is doing, and it's dispatching units, and it's saying make sure that you're not overloading any transmission lines, and at the same time, make sure that if one of those transmission lines goes out of service without unforeseen, there's an outage on a transmission line, make sure that the resulting flows don't have any violations either. And so it can change the dispatch around, and you can understand where the transmission constraints are on the system or congestion. A lot of times you'll also see the Plexos modeling done in what's called a zonal model. So in Dominion's case, you could say we know there's a transmission constraint getting power into Charleston. So instead of modeling every single transmission line, like if that's the major constraint, let's just model that one. And so you could set up the model and say, Dominion service territory is actually broken up into two pieces, the Charleston area and the rest of the state. And you'd say the maximum flow that you could get from the rest of the state into Charleston is, I'm making up a number here, but 1,500 megawatts. And so you could model that, and then the model could say, well, where do I want to add resources? Do I want to add it to the west of the state where maybe it's cheaper and there's land available, or do I want to add it to the Charleston region where it's going to be more expensive, but maybe you could defer some transmission upgrades? So that's a kind of a compromise solution. I would say both of these, I want to be clear, the work that the transmission planning team at Dominion's doing in the power flow still need to do that. It's not a replacement for that. I think the trick is how do you couple these two models together? And that's something that my company does. That's really what we try to specialize in, is how do you take both of those disciplines, as opposed to kind of the transmission planning world. There can be in a silo, and it's not just Dominion. This is across the industry. You have transmission planners that use one tool, and you have the generation planners that use another tool, and just not a lot of collaboration. And again, that's not just Dominion, that's really across the industry. And so we really work on how can you pass information between the two tools, and again, to get a better representation. And we're doing that. Like right now, we're doing a really large, using Plexos to evaluate transmission upgrades in New York City and Long Island, probably the most transmission constrained area in the country. It's no easy feat adding transmission there, a lot of congestion. And they're also taking out a lot of steam units in New York City right in the load pocket. And the question is, how do you do that if you're not adding new gas resources? And so transmission is the key to that.
Do you agree that the Williams Station is vital for load control and energy in the Charleston area?
It's a good question. We've looked at I've not done analysis to refute Mr. Parker's. I believe at times there's a need for a resource there today. Under today's transmission network, there are times throughout the year that there probably needs to be some generation. They've referred to it as must run. I will say, if you look at the data across the year, I think one of the commissioners spoke about declining capacity factor at Williams. It's not just the declining output of the plant. There's actually, the plant is offline many parts of the year. I think over 50% of the year, the plant is completely offline. Now, so in those periods, obviously, we don't need something there. But that is certainly during the high load winter periods, the high load summer periods, that's when the plant is going to be running. It's hard to know whether that's running because the system just needs more energy, or it needs energy specifically in that area. So tough to tell. I don't want to say there's no need for anything today. And certainly if the analysis is suggesting issues, then yeah, either transmission or another resource would need to be added there.
Talk to me a little bit about the cycle of batteries. You have them there. I don't know what the right word is, but you discharge them, you use them, and then, what are some of the possibilities for recharging them? Is it all at one time? Is there a kind of a variable schedule? I think we've been talking about batteries like they're this magical solution, but there's probably a lot of realities I want to understand.
Well, certainly there are a lot of realities, but at the same time, it will be the most flexible unit on the system. And I think if you talk to the Dominion operators, they'd be very excited to have a resource that can flip from full load to full generation in less than a second. Right? These things are extremely fast. They can respond to signals very accurately. They can ramp very quickly. So affords a lot of flexibility to the system operator. So in some sense, I think you would ask a system operator if you had a resource that you could really put anywhere on the grid and move it around really quickly. It's close to magic in a sense. You're right, there are realities though. We do have to think of when you charge the resource, how long is it available for? So take a 4-hour battery. We say 4-hour batteries. Basically what that's saying, if you have a 100 megawatt battery, and it's 4-hour duration, it has 400 megawatt hours of energy in the tank, if you will. And so you have a couple options. You could run it at 100 megawatts for 4 hours, or you could run it at 50 megawatts for 8 hours, or you could do it, anywhere in between. So it doesn't mean you have to run it for just 4 hours at a time, or it has to be consecutive hours. Again, a lot of flexibility in how you use it. You raise a really good question there about, well, do you have to charge it in 4 hours? The key thing here is you don't. And if there's concern, we heard a little bit of concern from Mr. Parker earlier in the week about being able to charge the resource in the load pocket. Well, if you have a 600 megawatt resource in the load pocket, you could either charge that.
What's the load pocket?
Sorry, in Charleston.
Okay.
Yeah, apologies. So if you have a 600 megawatt resource in Charleston, it sounded like there were some concerns if you could charge that, but you could always charge it at 300 megawatts over 8 hours, or you could do it over 12 hours and still be available for those peak conditions. So again, a lot of flexibility. The other thing, Mr. Walker, I think, testified about the changes in the tax code. Historically, the batteries had to be charged only with renewable resources in order to get the tax credit. That's since been revised in the Inflation Reduction Act. That's really important. It's really important, especially for Dominion and South Carolina. The reason for that is winter peak load. That's happening at 6 a.m., 7 a.m. before the sun even comes up. And so what that new revision to the tax code means is the battery, if it needs to, it can charge overnight when loads are low from a gas resource. Certainly if there's surplus renewables, you don't necessarily want to do that, but you have the operator would have that flexibility if they need to.
Switching gears, does your DSM modeling assume load reductions and energy savings greater than can be achieved?
I think so I use the DSM savings that Mr. Gravatt developed and provided, and I think he touched on kind of the technical potential at length. So we relied on his analysis and his testimony for that. And again, that was used for just one of the 3 portfolios we looked at. It was the enhanced reliability. Essentially, we evaluated the system only with solar and storage additions, and we said, well, we know there's concerns about reliability. What if we added additional energy efficiency? And what if we increase the duration of some of those batteries from 4 hours to 8 hours to really bolster the reliability of the system further? And so it was only used in that scenario, again, just in case there were concerns about reliability. Again, we showed that the base case portfolio without those additions was reliable, but again, just to get further comfortable with the portfolio, we showed that it was also lower cost than the Dominion preferred plan to add that on top.
Is Mr. Neely's contention that you agree that other utilities have annual limits on solar additions correct?
Well, certainly other utilities are using limits in their IRP modeling. Do I agree with those? Not necessarily. Certainly, you could run the model without the constraint. It would build a lot of solar. We're seeing that. It's with the IRA incentives, it's the lowest cost resource you could add to the system for energy. So it's going to build as much of it as it can. Now, certainly you can't build an unlimited amount of solar, so there's some trade-off there. I think the important thing I mentioned in my summary testimony is about how do you use models? Do you use it to inform decision making, or do you use it to kind of support a decision that's been made? I think those types of constraints are pretty dangerous at times, because what you want out of the model is, well, what should we build, right? And the model's saying the system should build a lot of solar. That's going to save ratepayer money. But with that constraint in there, you don't really know it. And so that type of constraint, that build constraint, it's a challenge to me. I think the purpose of modeling is to show us what should we go after. If the model's saying build as much solar as possible, now we need to go back and say, well, what's reasonable? How can we increase what's reasonable? Can we accelerate the interconnection? Can we build larger plants? A lot of the solar development that Dominion showed that in the past there's been years with 300 megawatts of solar added in a single year. Frankly, that was much different types of solar. It was PERPA facilities. These tend to be smaller. It wasn't done in a competitive procurement. I think if the company went out and said, we want to build, I'm just going to throw out a number, 1,000 megawatts of solar, I think there's going to be developers lining up to provide bids for that. So, what's reasonable? Certainly you can't build unlimited amounts of solar, but I think it's important to use the models to say, the model's saying we should be building a lot of solar and batteries because it's the cheapest resource with the incentives. Let's go figure out how we do that.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your being here and the testimony.
Thank you very much, Commissioner Williams.
Commissioner Justin Williams.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, sir, for being here today. I appreciate your enthusiasm about the subject.
Thank you.
I want to have a very practical conversation with you regarding why we're here and going through this exercise. You understand that at some point, once we finish the hearing, that the commission has to make a decision about the IRP that the company presented to us for consideration.
Yes, I do.
Okay. And I read through your testimony and I enjoyed listening to your testimony here today, but I can't say that I've actually heard you make a recommendation as to, from your position, what the commission should do with the company's IRP as presented. Do you have a recommendation for the commission?
Yeah, thank you. I think first and foremost, there's a variety of inputs and assumptions that I think are really critical to send the company back to the drawing board and say, we need to see results without certain things. So the key things to me are that battery limitation, the solar build out limitation, the bonus credits on solar, solar and storage. So I think there's some key things that really you need to go back, kind of reject the IRP, or whether you reject it or say we need to see additional results. That's up to you all. But I think there's the key assumptions that need to be done. Say, go back, show us a portfolio that looks like this, and show us the cost of that. And I outlined those proposals in the beginning of my testimony. So those are there. Certainly looking at the transmission impact assessment, making sure all options are on the table. It's not just batteries, not just solar, but what about synchronous condensers, STATCOMs, grid enhancing technologies? There's a lot there. We're going to need a lot of transmission in this country over the next several years, and we need to look at basically everything that's on the table to mitigate that.
Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate your comments and your opinion. Do you know, or do you have any experience with IRPs that don't require a commission's approval? As an example, it's just filed by the utility.
Yeah, all of the ones that I've been involved in, either as kind of an intervener or like on a technical review committee, I believe all of those need commission approval.
Okay, and why do you think that is?
I think a lot of what we're talking about today, there's if the IRP is being used as a decision-making document, or at least to set the strategy, need to make sure that the inputs, the assumptions, the way that modeling was conducted was done in a fair, transparent way. And yeah, I think it's good to have that checks and balance, whether it comes from you all, it comes from other people intervening and looking under the hood. I think it is important to make sure that plan is being conducted in a way that should be executed for the ratepayers.
And would it be fair to say that if the utility were allowed to just file the IRP with the commission for information purposes, if you will, that there may be a question to fairness and transparency in that process?
Yeah, I do. I would be worried about the fairness and transparency. I think the other thing is, what do you do with that? At some point, the utility is going to have to make a proposal to do something, whether it's retire an asset, build something new, and all of these assumptions, these quirks that are coming up to the surface here and that I talked about, those are going to have to be discussed at some point. So to the extent possible, let's get those on the table. Let's get that ironed out, whether it's in the stakeholder process here in the IRP, so that when the utility goes to make an actual commitment, some of that's already been squared away. I know a lot of other states, or maybe not a lot of other, several other states are using kind of a two-phased IRP process, where the first phase is basically what we're talking about here today. It's show us what the model gave with certain generic resources and what did the model build. Let's make sure all the inputs and assumptions are right. So that's phase one. Phase two is, well, once we kind of made a decision that we're retiring coal plants and we're going to do an all-source procurement, let's go and now do that procurement in phase two. And now all those inputs and assumptions have already been agreed upon by the commission, by the parties, by the utility. And so it kind of accelerates that phase two process. So we don't have to kind of fight over the assumptions every time. So I know Colorado does that, New Mexico does that, Hawaii does that. I'm sure several other states. But.
I understand. And again, thank you for sharing that perspective. So based on that, you would agree that through the course of this process, from the initial filing, discovery, and now up to your testimony, that this process has been transparent. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would say it's transparent.
And do you feel that you've had a fair opportunity to participate?
Yes, I would.
Okay. And so just based off what you've experienced here, this process is arguably more fair and more transparent than just utility just filing an IRP.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So in terms of what we do next, whatever that may be, we can feel confident, the commission can feel confident that up to your testimony here today, that this process has been fair and transparent. Is that correct?
Yes, I'd say my opinions have been heard. You've gotten a chance to read my testimony, listen to me speak today. So yes, it's been heard, and I think it's been transparent and fair.
Okay. So when we're looking at the options available to us for consideration, you understand that while there's an option to reject the IRP, there also is an option to accept with modifications. Do you understand that?
Yes.
Okay. And do you also understand that there is a yearly update that happens in between the major filings or the triennial filings? You understand that part, right?
Yes, I guess the one thing I would say is there's a tendency with all these updates, with all these filings, it does take time. It drags on, right? And what I worry about is just when are decisions going to be made? We've kind of heard throughout this proceeding, it's like, well, that belongs in this docket and that decision belongs in this docket. We were all here, well, not everyone, but a lot of us were here 3 years ago talking about the same retirement of Williams and Wateree. There's been some additional analysis, but really no firm decisions, right? We've already heard the date got pushed from 2028 to 2031, and then I think we heard yesterday that that's really the earliest feasible date, and we'll have to assess that in the next IRP. So I guess the decision on whether to reject, accept with modification, or push things to the next, I guess I'm indifferent to some extent on that decision. I think that's all best suited for you all. What I worry about is just the lack of there just being a line in the sand. We need to make a decision on these coal retirements. Every time we push this off to the next proceeding or the next IRP, just delays those decisions and takes options off the table, I think.
I understand that. Would you agree with me that ultimately it's not the commission's decision as to when any utility-owned asset is retired?
I don't know the regulatory statute in the state to make that call on whose decision. I would say it's ultimately the utility's decision, and it's the commission's responsibility to make sure that's a prudent and in the best interest of the ratepayers.
Okay, well, loosely, let's go with that. So in reference to this plan, considering that, according to you, and I would agree with you, that the process has been fair, that it's been transparent, that where we are now by way of South Carolina's IRP statute, has given your clients and other interveners and really any the ratepayers. We actually had customer testimony in this proceeding, which is something we did not have in the last. This has given much more access, in addition to transparency and fairness to the process than existed before. You would agree with that, right?
Then previously, yes. I would say there's not many interveners, and I don't know what's driving that relative to what I've been involved in Colorado or other states. Like Colorado, I think Excel Colorado had 10, 12 interveners, and each one had multiple experts. So, yeah, it's certainly more fair, transparent, open. I think anybody can participate. I think there's a question, why aren't more people participating? But again, you can't force folks to participate.
I understand that. And so considering all of that, what I'm trying to figure out is it best to take your testimony and other testimonies in consideration as we continue to go through this process, or is it better to reject the IRP and just adopt the recommendations that you're making? Considering that this is a plan, like it's not, anything that's in the IRP, the utility is not going to necessarily be tied to that without the opportunity to pivot or to change directions depending on what happens in the environment, the economic environment, the political landscape, the physical environment. Is that fair? I mean, do you understand where I'm coming from?
Yeah, I would say it's been fair, transparent. I understand that it's a planning document. I'd say at this point, the plan is flawed. And so I would be worried about the utility continuing down that plan without a course correction.
Okay. I think that's fair.
Yeah.
That's fair. So flawed, meaning that it's not the most reasonable and prudent.
Correct, or at least cost, or reasonable, prudent, least cost, and didn't evaluate all the options, or even a wide range of options.
Okay. So when you say evaluate all the options, you mean, is it evaluate for evaluation's sake, or evaluate to find better solutions to the provision of energy?
I would say evaluate to find better options, lower cost options, more prudent options. Okay. And at the end of the day, just it's good to look at alternative options, right? Every plan, or at least the vast majority of the portfolios put forward by the company, all included a very large gas resource, if not all of them proposing a large combined cycle. Now, I think we can argue about how the IRP was done in 2020, but it was a different approach, not quite an optimization. Like with an optimization, you get all the inputs lined up, you press go on the model, and it spits out an answer. The way it was done back in 2020 is there's distinct portfolios set up, and then they evaluated those. Certainly I do agree kind of where we are today with an optimization is good, but what you lose is kind of a wide range of outcomes. And I think even if you kind of took the company's portfolio at face value and agreed with every one of their assumptions and agreed that it was the lowest cost option, I don't think they showed a wide range of options. And we heard from a lot of public stakeholders that might be willing to pay 0.5% more for a drastically different and cleaner portfolio. And then certainly when you look at different assumptions, that could actually be lower cost. So I think there's also just looking at a wider range of potential options is important.
I understand that. But based on what you know about 2020 and where we are today, would you say that we made some progress? When I say we, the process.
Yes.
In total.
Yep. There's been
progress made.
Yes.
Thank you so much for indulging me. I appreciate your testimony and your enthusiasm.
Thank you, Commissioner Williams.
That's all I have, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner Williams. Commissioners, any further questions for this witness? Oh, Commissioner Thomas, thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Just have a couple of questions. So in connection with batteries, and you were talking about the ability to put in battery storage of like 600 megawatts or whatever. And then draw down 50 at a time or 100 at a time or so forth. Is the Plexus modeling system capable of seeing how that works and plays into the whole picture?
Yep, absolutely. So in the Plexus model, you basically set it up with a duration, amount of storage in the tank, if you will, the maximum that it can charge or discharge, the round trip efficiency, and then it will optimize the schedule to minimize costs. And so it's also not just about charging and discharging. A lot of the value of battery storage is providing reserves. So a lot of times the battery, a great thing about battery, you might hear a 4-hour resource and say, oh, well, it's only available 4 hours a day. Well, actually, even when it's not charging or discharging, it's providing a lot of value. It can provide spinning reserve, it can provide regulation reserve, and so it's providing tremendous value. In fact, the very early editions, most of the value will be from providing reserve. So even when it's quote unquote not doing anything in terms of charging or discharging, it's adding a lot of reliability to the system.
And you mentioned it provides spinning reserves, and you said something earlier that I didn't understand, and that was, I think you said something to the effect that if the Williams plant is retired, the turbine can still spin. I don't understand that at all. Is that, can you help me out there?
Yeah, and somewhat beyond my certainly beyond my electrical engineering prowess, because I'm not an electrical engineer. But essentially, what a synchronous condenser is the generator from a power plant that can spin, and it's basically absorbing and pushing reactive power onto the system. So it's providing the same or very similar grid stability and grid strength at that location, but it's not requiring fuel to push out. So it's not providing any energy. It's not providing any megawatts onto the grid. It's purely just providing grid stabilization. And you can do that with a new synchronous condenser. So you could build one greenfield. You just call up Siemens or GE and put in a new one. Or you can do what's called a conversion, where you take an existing coal plant, take the steam turbine off of it, basically, and just have the generator casing there. And you're seeing that more and more in places across the country as coal plants are being decommissioned. It's just an alternative use of using that infrastructure. Again, because a lot of times those coal plants were specifically put in a location where they were needed, right? They were sited very strategically where there wasn't a gas pipeline or there was a load or something like that. So it's a good option. Not necessarily saying it would mitigate all of the transmission constraints for Dominion, but certainly something that could be looked at.
Well, that's an interesting concept. So in connection with batteries and charging batteries, can they be charged and discharged at the same time? And does that even make any sense?
I think technically you could, but to your latter point, I don't think it would make sense to do that at the same battery, right? You'd just be incurring round trip efficiency losses. So, for every megawatt hour you charge the battery, you're only getting, call it 0.8687 megawatt hours on the back end of it, because it's cycling through. So I don't think you'd want to do that at one location. There might be times where in Charleston you want to be charging, but in Wateree you want to be discharging. But I don't think you'd want to do that. Technically it would be capable because the battery is actually set up in a lot of discrete blocks, right? So if you had a 600 megawatt battery, it's going to be a lot of containers. Each of them have their own batteries, their own inverters. So you could technically do that. But.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you, Commissioner Thomas.
Thank you, Commissioner Thomas. Commissioners, any further questions for the witness? Hearing none, any redirect?
Just one, Madam Chair. Mr. Stenslick, could you just reiterate, for clarification purposes, what your recommendations were for this specific 2023 IRP, which I believe are in Table 2 of your testimony?
Sure, thank you. All right, so, and I tried to make this shorter. One of the things that came out of the stakeholder process is we provided a lot of recommendations, and we got some feedback saying, we can't do all of this, right? And that's fair. We provided a lot of recommendations and created a lot of work for the Dominion team, I'm sure. So what I tried to do is start to prioritize some of those. So I listed in Table 2 the highest priorities, so not the only things. The first one, basically evaluate one portfolio that didn't add a fossil fuel resource. So takes Williams and Wateree offline and just looks at what that portfolio might look like if a gas resource wasn't available. If we couldn't build that pipeline, if the and it wasn't feasible, or we don't want it. So I think regardless of the optimization and the inputs, again, going back, Commissioner Williams, to that comment, let's just look at a wider range. So that's the first one. The second is incorporating the IRA energy community bonus credits for standalone storage and at least some potential for new solar additions. So we saw the map. One thing I'll add is that map of energy communities is going to grow. So when Williams and Wateree come offline, those areas become energy communities because they used to have a coal plant. So the census tract that they're in and all of the adjacent census tracts are eligible for the 10% bonus credit. So certainly I would say all standalone storage should get that, and at least some portion of the PV additions. And again, that's a 10% reduction in the capital cost. The third is remove the arbitrary 50-50 utility self-build and PPA solar resource ratio, whichever resource candidate is lower cost. I didn't really see a need to put that into the model. At the end of the day, I think Mr. Neely talked about needing a diversity of business structures. At the end of the day, if there are third-party PPAs, there's going to be a diversity of third parties in there. There's going to be, actually, if you went with the 50-50 split, the utility would be the primary builder of those resources. So even if at the end of the day, the decision on who builds what is for further dockets, but again, I don't think it's needed in the model. When we did the modeling, I will say we made that adjustment to both our portfolio and Dominion's just to make sure we weren't favoring the costs of one versus the other. The fourth was increase annual build limits for solar resources and make storage resources available earlier in the horizon. So again, make sure that there is a replacement option to see if the model selects it. The fifth was fixing the heat rate for new gas resources to, again, reflect the error that was identified and accepted by the utility. On transmission upgrade costs, make sure we know if a gas resource is being added to candidates. We know the costs that are attributed to that gas resource versus the costs that are required to retire the coal plant. Right now, I think those are muddied, so let's make sure that we can properly assign those costs. And lastly, this was another error that was identified and agreed to by the company, but fix the battery, fixed operations and maintenance cost and average cost of capital that were identified. Again, the utility said that they agreed with that and said they would fix that. So again, there's a lot of recommendations, ideas throughout my testimony. Those are the top 7. I think if you put those 7 in the model, you'd get a potentially very different result.
Great, thank you. No further questions.
Any recross on that limited? Hearing none.
Madam Chair?
None from CCEVA, ma'am. No, thank you.
Commissioner Justin
I
Williams?
just have one quick question, if you don't mind. Based on your recommendations, sir, what difference would it make if the commission ordered that those recommendations or those items be put into the modeling today or after this, or reject the IRP and those actions are performed immediately compared to being performed throughout the 1-year update period?
If you put these in the portfolio today, you're going to get a very different least cost plan that comes out of the model. And so the preferred portfolio, the most prudent, reasonable portfolio will look very different than the one the company proposed. And so it's really about what we talked a lot about, what's the purpose of the IRP. If it's setting strategic direction for the utility, informing future procurements, those are going to look very different. If these changes are made, those will look very different than what the company has out there today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Stenklick, thank you very much for your testimony today and your thoughts, and we appreciate you being here. And
Thank you very much, Chair.
You may
I'll
stand
work
down.
on my pronunciation.
We probably all say it differently here in South Carolina, too. I just go by there occasionally. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ms. Jaffe or Ms. Who we got? Ms. Clancy?
Yes, CCL, SACE, and Sierra Club call joint witness Chelsea Hoteling to the stand, and I believe she is appearing
She's virtual.
virtually.
Do we have the There we go. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Pronounce your last name for me.
It's Hoteling.
Hoteling. Ms. Hoteling, state your name for me, please.
My name is Chelsea Hoteling.
And would you raise your right hand and let me swear you in as a witness? Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. Ms. Clancy, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chair Bowser. Hello, Ms. Hoteling. Could we start off with you providing your name, title, and employer for the commission, please?
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Chelsea Hoteling. I'm a consultant at Energy Futures Group.
And Ms. Hoteling, did you cause to be pre-filed in this docket on August 15th, 2023, surrebuttal testimony consisting of 13 pages?
Yes.
Do you have any changes or corrections to your pre-filed surrebuttal testimony at this time?
No, I do not.
Ms. Hoteling, if the questions put to you in your testimony were asked at the hearing today, would your answers be the same?
Yes, they would.
And did you also attach your CV as an exhibit to your surrebuttal testimony, identified as Exhibit CH1 and consisting of 4 pages?
Yes, I did.
Chair Belzer, I would now move to have Ms. Hoteling's pre-filed surrebuttal testimony and 1 exhibit entered into the record as if given orally from the stand.
Ms. Hoteling's pre-filed surrebuttal testimony will be read into the record as if given from the stand. Her exhibit, which accompanied that pre-filed testimony and labeled CH1, will be marked for identification as hearing Exhibit 18 and received into the evidence of this case.
Thank you. Now, Ms. Hoteling, I'm going to ask you some questions to elicit a summary of your testimony, but to start, could you please describe your education and training and tell the commission about what your current job entails?
Yes, I can. I received a bachelor's degree in accounting and economics from Elmira College in 2011. I also received a master's in business administration in 2012, a master's in data analytics in 2020, and a master's in environmental policy in 2019 from Clarkson University. My resume, included as Exhibit CH1, provides additional detail regarding my professional and educational experience. I worked for 7 years in electric utility regulation and related fields. I have reviewed dozens of integrated resource plans and related filings by utilities in Arizona, Colorado, Kansas, Kentucky, Iowa, Indiana, Michigan, Missouri, Montana, Minnesota, New Mexico, Nova Scotia, Puerto Rico, and South Carolina. In my role at Energy Futures Group, or EFG, which is the same clean energy consulting firm that employs Mr. Gravatt, I help to deliver projects on behalf of energy regulators, government agencies, utilities, and advocacy organizations. EFG staff regularly provides expert witness testimony on efficiency programs, integrated resource planning, and related policy issues and regulatory proceedings in 20 states and 5 Canadian provinces. Although I personally have not testified as an expert before this commission, I have filed testimony before the Kentucky Public Service Commission, the Colorado Public Utilities Commission, the Michigan Public Service Commission, and the Iowa Utilities Board.
And do you have experience running the models that electrical utilities use to determine the optimal resource mix and ensure resource adequacy?
Yes, I have performed my own capacity expansion, production costs, and reliability modeling in numerous cases using multiple models, including Encompass, Aurora, Plexus, and the Strategic Energy and Risk Evaluation Model, otherwise known as SERVM.
And do you typically conduct this modeling in IRP proceedings?
Yes, I do. I have conducted Encompass modeling and IRPs for Xcel Minnesota, Minnesota Power, Evergy, Otter Tail Power, Duke Energy Indiana, and I've also performed modeling in CPCN and other proceedings, including for the New Mexico CPCN, the Xcel Colorado ERP, Consumers Energy, DTE Electric, a project that I worked on looking at 100% clean energy in New Mexico. And I've also performed SERVM and Plexus modeling in support of testimony that was filed for the KU and LG&E pending CPCN case.
Chair Belzer, at this time, based on Ms. Hoteling's extensive experience, I would request that she be qualified as an expert in capacity expansion and production cost modeling.
Any questions of Wadir of the witness about her qualifications? Hearing none, we will accept Ms. Hoteling as an expert in capacity expansion and production cost modeling.
Yes, perfect. Thank you. Ms. Hoteling, could you please explain now the purpose of your surrebuttal testimony? What statements in Dominion's rebuttal are you responding to?
Yes, several Dominion witnesses made unsubstantiated claims in rebuttal that the alternative portfolios presented in Mr. Steinklick's direct testimony, which replaced coal with solar and storage, would compromise system reliability. They further suggest building a large combined cycle gas plant is necessary to ensure system reliability when coal plants retire. To test this criticism of Mr. Steinklick's portfolios, I used the Strategic Energy and Risk Evaluation Model, or SERVM, to evaluate whether Mr. Steinklick's alternative resource portfolio, titled the Alternative Plan 2031 Coal Retirement Portfolio, satisfies industry standards for reliability. The Alternative Plan 2031 Coal Retirement Portfolio replaces Das Watery and Williams coal plants by 2031 with non-fossil fuel resources, but continues to rely on the significant amount of gas already on the DES system.
And so how can SERVM typically be used in resource planning?
Typically, SERVM can be used to determine the planning reserve margin, or PRM, necessary for a utility system to satisfy reliability metrics, and can also be used to calculate effective load carrying capacity of solar or storage resources.
Is that how Dominion used SERVM to develop its 2023 IRP?
Yes, Astrape, on behalf of DESC, used the SERVM software to develop the PRM and the ELCC of solar and battery storage resources, which it then used as inputs into the capacity expansion modeling that DESC conducted in Plexus.
And does SERVM also have a third function which Dominion did not use?
Yes, SERVM can also be used to independently evaluate specific candidate resource portfolios, essentially the outputs of a capacity expansion modeling software such as Plexus, to determine whether complete portfolios satisfy the reliability criteria. This evaluation of SERVM produces several reliability metrics, including loss of load expectation, or LOLE, loss of load hours, and expected unserved energy, which can be used to evaluate the reliability of a resource portfolio. Most typically, utilities use a 1-day and 10-year LOLE reliability standard, which translates to about 0.1 days per year, which in plain language means that a portfolio is expected to have at least 1 day of lost load every 10 years.
Is this how you conducted SERVM to evaluate the reliability of Mr. Steinklick's Alternative Plan 2031 coal retirement portfolio?
Yes.
And so did you use the same SERVM dataplace that Astrape developed for the Dominion system to conduct your evaluation of Mr. Steinklick's portfolio?
Yes, I used the same SERVM database that Astrape developed for DES system to conduct its PRM and ELCC studies. This means that the data used in my analysis, such as resource characteristics and availability, is specific to DES system and incorporates DES' own assumptions. However, to best evaluate Mr. Steinklick's Alternative Plan 2031 coal retirement portfolio, I had to make several discrete changes to DES SERVM database. So first, DES SERVM database was configured to evaluate the study year 2026, but I changed the summer and winter peak demand to reflect what was included in Plexus and the Plexus load forecast for 2031. I chose 2031 because this reflects the point in time when non-fossil resources would have replaced Williams coal capacity in Mr. Steinklick's portfolio, and when, according to DES witnesses, the portfolio's reliability would be most in question. Also, to reflect the resource mix in 2031, I added the new solar and storage resource builds in Mr. Steinklick's portfolio and included the retirement of the Williams coal plant. Lastly, I applied operational constraints for the demand response resources, and I included the SEPA Hydro resource that was set up in the CERVM database.
And so, having made those changes, what did your CERVM evaluation of Mr. Stenslick's alternative plan 2031 coal retirement portfolio find?
The Alternative Plan 2031 coal retirement portfolio has an LOE metric of 0.04 days per year, which outperforms the industry standard of 0.1 days per year and demonstrates that a portfolio that replaces the Wateree and Williams coal plants with non-fossil resources exceeds standard reliability metrics.
Thank you, Ms. Hoteling. Chair Belzer, Ms. Hoteling is now available for cross-examination and questions from the Commission.
Thank you, Ms. Clancy. Sasiba?
No questions for this witness.
Thank you, Mr. Witt. Office of Regulatory Staff?
No questions, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Huber. Dominion?
No questions, Chair Belzer.
Thank you, Mr. Burgess. Commissioners? Ms. Hoteling, I had a question. You referenced the SEPA Hydro resource. Where are you? I'm looking. Okay. The SEPA Hydro resource in your survey rebuttal testimony. Could you explain that?
Yes, so there was a few different hydro resources that were represented in the CERVM database that I reviewed that the companies provided. They had an allocation, an emergency hydro allocation, and then the SEPA hydro resource they were each modeled as individual resources in the database. But for the modeling that I reviewed, it appeared that the SEPA hydro resource hadn't been turned on and selected to be in the study. And so upon review of the hydro that was modeled in Plexus compared to the size of the hydro that was modeled in CERVM, it appeared that that SEPA hydro resource from my review should be included in the study. So that is why I made that change to the database to ensure that the modeling for our alternative portfolio had that SEPA hydro resource included. And it has a approximate capacity size of about 16 to 20 megawatts.
And that is one of the few changes that you made to the model from what Dominion had run to what you ran?
Yes, that was one of the changes I made.
And those are the only changes that you made that are listed in your testimony? They're what, 4, 5? They're 5, I think?
Yes, that is correct.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Commissioners, any questions? Any redirect?
No redirect.
Ms. Hoteling, thank you for your appearance today and for your testimony. We appreciate your thoughts, and you may stand down as a witness.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anything else from the joint, I'm going to say joint interveners. Well, Sierra Club, say CCL.
No, nothing further from us.
Okay.
Nothing further from us. That concludes our case.
Is there anything else that needs to come before the commission in this docket? Our staff council had to leave, and so I'll ask staff council to email y'all with proposed dates. I don't know if any of you've made arrangements to secure the transcript or not. If you need it, please do so. And with that, I'd like to thank all of you for being here. As always, I really appreciate your professionalism in your presentations, and just appreciate the job that you all do. So with that, I hope everybody stays safe with this crazy weather that's headed our way, and we adjourn this proceeding, and we'll put it on an agenda after proposed orders to render a decision. Thank you very much. Stay safe. We are adjourned.